Hello, friends. Hello, hello. Happy Thursday. Yes. Happy Thursday. Every time I say what day it is, and I know that I say this every time I say what day it is, but I panic. And it's like, is it Thursday? Did I make some outlandish claim? But no, it's Thursday. Happy Thursday. It's almost the weekend. You're doing it. Does tomorrow count as a working day? Yes. But tomorrow's Friday, so it's a little bit better. Hopefully somebody brings in like donuts or treats or something into your work tomorrow. That always makes Fridays better. You thought yesterday was Thursday repeatedly. I yes, I get that. If I do things on a different day that I usually do on a certain day, then I just am lost. I'm lost and confused. Hey, Rotellus. Hello, hello. Never could get the hang of Thursdays. I get it. I get it. Thursday is weird. Well, and if you have like a short week, that also throws everything off. So, yeah. Yeah. Oh, Red Talus, thank you so much for the hydrate. Starting off strong. I appreciate it. You know I haven't been hydrating all day. Thank you for calling me on this. um, did anybody watch Mandalorian last night? Because I did, and I have thoughts. I love the cute little, oh no, what are they called? The like little mechanics. I forgot what creature they're called. And something like that. But they were super cute. And I love them and I want a bunch of them to be my mechanics for always. And to fix things around the house for always. And I would feed them and I would take care of them and I would take them on walks. But yeah, I thought those were super, super cute. There's a lot of setup, and I'm really excited for this season. I knew that Bo Katan was coming back, and I'm excited that she's back. And I have so many things. There's things that I forgot that were like mentioned in this one, and it's like, oh yeah, totally. Yes, like the dark saber. That was like a huge part of the last season, and it just like left my brain that it was even a thing. So so that's cool and I'm excited for it. And I'm excited for just little Grogu and his little outfit and his little floating ball carriage. Love that. So, yeah. I am excited. I will be watching it every week. And it'll be great. And I'm ready. I'm ready. Cause like all that Book of Boba did was make me want another episode of or another season of Mandalorian. That's all it did. And now we have it, and I'm excited. Also, something else that I'm excited for tomorrow, I'm going to go see Demon Slayer in theaters. I'm really excited. It's divided weird though, and I don't know exactly where they're gonna start or where they're I mean, I know where they're gonna end, but I don't really know like where they're gonna start and how they're gonna do it because it is starting if you've read this, then you'll know. And if you haven't, then you'll just know that it's like in between an arc. So it's starting at the end of the entertainment district arc. Not at the beginning. You don't get the beginning. No, don't be silly. That would make way too much sense. No, you don't get it. You just get like the last like hurrah in the entertainment district and then you get like the first episode or like the first book in the swordsman arc. And I I'm excited, yes, because I love Demon Slayer with all of my heart, but I don't know how they're going to do it. I will find out tomorrow. It's the last two episodes. Okay, it's the last two episodes of Entertainment District and the first episode of the new arc. It is weird. I don't know why they wouldn't just be like, this is the one arc, because the other movie, the first movie that they did, was just like one arc. It was like the train arc, the um and that was really good, and it was amazing and wonderful. So we'll see. We'll see. Also, I don't know if it's called the train arc. I just know that there's a train in it for like most of it, so I just call it the train arc. It's probably not called the train arc. So yeah, I'm curious. I have curiosities, but I guess I'll find out tomorrow. So yeah, I'm doing that tomorrow, and I'm excited. I'm excited. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I'm excited about. I mean, I'm always excited, but I don't think so. Don't think so. I mean, I'm watching One Piece for the first time, and I'm excited about that, but that's like old news. Nobody cares about my excitement or updates for that. I'm not reading it, I'm watching it, and I have like a guide, so I'm not watching any of the filler episodes and stuff. And it's a doozy. It's a doozy. There's a lot of episodes, over 1,000 episodes. I think I'm in like the 400s. But oh, I just love it. Love it so much. Love it. uh, so yeah. If we weren't convinced that I was an uber dork, we are now. I was going to go to C2E2 as one of the characters from One Piece, but I'm not anymore. I have changed my mind. Um, I'm gonna be a chain chomp. I will take pictures. I will post them on my social media, but I'm really excited. So yeah, I think those are all the like non-bookish updates that I have. I'm just really excited for Mandalorian. But yeah, I think so. Okay, reading updates. Things that are actually related to this channel. I am reading Harry Soto is Back by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I started it on Monday during reading sprints and will be continuing it on Friday. I'm not super far into it. I'm on page 57, which sounds like a lot, but it's not. It's large type, so it goes really fast. There are 478 pages. So again, I'm really not that far at all. And it is a tennis book. It's a historical fiction book that focuses around a tennis player. It starts with her, Carrie Soto, and her dad watching a tennis match. I think it's the US Open. Let me double check because it says like right in front. Yep, the US Open in 1994, and one of the players ties Carrie in her records for wins, and she decides that she is going to go back into training and be a tennis player again. She's only 37, but she's like, oh, 37. You know, you know, you know how athletes are. And so yeah. And then so once that is decided, we go back in time into 19 should I have been prepared? Maybe. Am I ever prepared? No. 1955. So then we get the time block 1955 to 1965, and it is going through her training the first time around, like how she got the record to begin with. And her dad is a coach. He is known as the Jaguar, and he is just a super amazing tennis player. He came from out of the country. I don't remember which country he came from, but he started working at a country club, and people were like amazed with him and everything like that. Nudes! Hey Noodles, welcome in. Hello, hello. Happy Thursday. Oh, oh, hi friend. So yeah, I'm reading that. It's it's good. I like it. I mean, Taylor Jenkins Reid can do. Oh, you like my shirt? Her writing is super super easy to get into. So I'm not worried about that. I've read her other books. It's great. Thank you, thank you. And I picked up this book, which totally does not seem like the book that would like or would ever pick up. It is for a book club, and I didn't pick it. None of this would have happened if Prince were alive. I have not started it. I don't know what it's about. The first three words in the synopsis are "Mom down, y'all," which is not convincing me that I'm gonna like it, but we will see. I will go into this with an open mind, maybe. But yeah, I'm totally judging it from the cover. We'll see. We'll see. We'll see. And I'm also reading a dark fantasy book, the fifth season by N.K. Jemisin. I just don't happen to have it with me right this moment. But tonight's book is a doozy. You finished the Lego Star Wars! Amazing. Amazing. How was it? What is your review? Did you enjoy it? I've heard that the Lego one is really good. I have not. I don't. Well, I know that I haven't played it, but I don't think I've watched anybody play it either. Oh, hello, Falcor. Hello, hello. Good to see you again. I hopped into your stream on Tuesday. I was just lurking. But Treasure Island, amazing. Oh my gosh, I'm terrible. I should be doing shout outs. And here I am not. Okay, let's do some shout outs. There's a couple. There's a couple. Let's do it. Okay. Did that work? Excellent. Okay, so Fantastic Noodles, the always wonderful, amazing Fantastic Noodles, does play games, but is also reading The Hobbit. So, if you're enjoying reading streams, hop in, reading them on Monday evenings. Yes. And then also, oh wait, no, hold on. My gosh, the shout out command is just not amazing. Oh, thank you so much for putting that in there. Fantastic. Noodles. I always feel like I have to say your full name. I know you just go by Noodles and just by Nudes, but I'm just like saying the full name. Okay. And then Falcor. Oh, okay. I have to wait 1 minute and 14 seconds to do another shout out. Hold on. Almighty Angel, thank you so much for the follow. Welcome in. Hello, hello. Well, in 1 minute and 14 seconds, when I can do another shout out. Falcor is also a reader on Twitch and streams on Tuesday, Thursday, and Sunday, 7 p.m. Pacific time, and is currently reading Treasure Island. Maybe. No, is currently reading Treasure Island. Okay, cool. I was like, I also follow on Twitter, so maybe, maybe not. Okay, can we do a shout out this time? Oh my gosh. I wish you could just do like a tag or have the name start filling in all the shout outs. Oh my gosh. I have to wait 6 seconds. All the bookish folks unite. Exactly. Exactly. In our own separate blankies with our own separate books. With our tea. You can tab with the can you? Oops, hold on. You can. You are literally teaching me everything about streaming. You would think that I have never done it before. I am shouting out a channel that does not exist. Hold on. Oh. We'll get there. We'll get there. There we go. There we go. Shout out to Falcor. You're right. You're totally right, Noodles. I'm just a slow one over here. All right. So today's book, Vera by Elizabeth von Arnim, is very upsetting. So I did pin a comment. I did look up all of the trigger warnings. So if you're sensitive to any material, please be aware that I did do that. Yes, there is a content warning. Yes, yes, yes. And I should be doing that for all of the books because in my own, like, I don't even know, wonder of nobody ever writes anything controversial. Just like, doop, doop, doop. Yes. And then I am surprised, and I feel like I shouldn't be surprised by this. Yeah, it totally did come out of left field. Absolutely. So, what this book is about, we are only on chapter 5, so we are not too far away. However, it seems like so much has escalated so quickly. So, it is about Lucy Entwinkle, which Entwistle, there it is. Lucy Entwistle just lost her dad, and Weems, who we don't even know his first name, Weems. But Weems is walking about having a terrible day, sees Lucy staring off into space, who just lost her dad that day, literally 3 hours prior, and is bopping about and is like, oh, I need to tell my tragic tale to this person because my life is so much worse than anybody else. And so tells Lucy his story that he just lost his wife. She completed suicide. Well, it is debated if it was a accident or if it was on purpose. It's a whole controversy that it was in the newspapers, everything like that. But Lucy doesn't have a newspaper. She just moved there. And so they sort of bond through their tragedy. And yeah, he claims exactly. They sort of bond through their tragedy, and he like invited himself to like sleep on her couch, and people just assumed that Weems is like a friend of Lucy's dad who died, and nobody has corrected them at all. And let's see what else has happened. They went to Lucy's dad's funeral, and that day, like at dinner, he's like, all right, well, there is a huge age gap. Yes. Lucy's only 22, and I don't remember how old Weems is, but is like father age. I don't know. 40s. That sounds good. Um, and that night, like as soon as they're done having dinner, it's like, all right, well, we need to stop being sad because I just can't take it anymore. And pretty much tells Lucy and Lucy's aunt the same thing. Like, you need to cut it out, and we need to laugh, and we need to smile, and we need to be joyful. And he's saying this outside underneath a mulberry tree in the darkness because he wants to hold Lucy's hand and nobody will be able to see it. It's it's very there's so many things. Yes, he does tell Lucy to smile more. Yes. Oh, okay. I'm getting so many goosebumps by this. That should also be a warning. Told to smile more. Yeah. Yeah, because this book was published in 1921, so literally forever. Gross old dudes. Exactly. And this has all just been like an introduction. We are only like, let's see. I mean, we're about to start chapter 5. We are 13% of the way through. Like, buckle up, people. But yeah, with that, let's get started. So, fair warning, upsetting, cringy. Here we go. Chapter 5. Men can easily be gross. Yes. Yes, you're totally right, Falcor. Yes, he does keep comparing Lucy to his late wife, Vera. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Luckily, they're not all Weemses. Very true. All right. Nevertheless, he was not able to persuade her to join him with Lucy in a trip abroad. He said that it would be good for them to get away for a time, to be happy, basically. She was tirelessly concerned to do and say everything she could that showed her deep sympathy with him in his loss. He had told her nothing beyond the bare fact, and she was not one to read about inquests, and her deep sense of obligation to him that he, laboring under so great a burden of sorrow of his own, should have helped them with such devotion and unselfishness in theirs. But she wouldn't go abroad. She was going, she said, to her little house in London with Lucy. What, in August? Exclaimed Weems. Yes, they would be quiet there, and indeed they were both worn out and only wished for solitude. Then why not stay here? Asked Weems, who now considered Lucy's aunt selfish. This is solitary enough, in all conscience. No. They neither of them felt they could bear to stay in that house. Lucy must go to the place least connected in her mind with her father. Indeed, it was best. She did so understand and appreciate Mr. Weems's wonderful and unselfish motives in suggesting the continent, but she and Lucy were in that state when the idea of a hotel and waiters and a band was simply impossible to them, and all they wished was to creep into the quiet and privacy of their own nest. Like wounded birds, said poor Miss Entwistle, looking up at him with much the piteous expression of a dog lifting an injured paw. So unselfish. It's very bad for Lucy to be encouraged to think she's a wounded bird, said Weems, controlling his disappointment as best as he could. You must come and see us in London and help us to feel heroic, said Miss Entwistle, with a watery smile. But I can come and see you much better and easier if you're here, persisted Weems. Miss Entwistle, however, though watery, was determined. She refused to stay where she so conveniently was, and Weems now considered Lucy's aunt obstinate as well as selfish, although he thought her very ungrateful. She had made use of him, and now was going to leave him, without apparently giving him a thought, in the lurch. He was having a good deal of Miss Entwistle, because during the 2 days that came after the funeral, Lucy was practically invisible, engaged in collecting and packing her father's belongings. Weems hung about the garden, not knowing when these activities mightn't suddenly cease, and not wishing to miss her if she did come out, and Miss Entwistle, who couldn't help Lucy in this, no one could help her in the heartbreaking work, naturally joined him. He found these 2 days long. Miss Entwistle felt there was a great bond between herself and him, and Weems felt there wasn't. When she said there was, he had difficulty in not contradicting her. Not only, Miss Entwistle felt, and also explained, was there the bond of their dear Jim, whom both she and Mr. Weems had so much loved, but there was this communion of sorrow, the loss of his wife, the loss of her brother, within the same fortnight. Weems shut his mouth tight at this and said nothing. How natural for her, feeling so sorry for him, feeling so grateful to him, when from a window during those 2 days she beheld him sitting solitary beneath the mulberry tree, to go down and sit there with him. How natural that, when he got up, made restless, she supposed, by his memories, and began to pace the lawn, she should get up and sympathetically pace it, too. She could not let this kind, tender-hearted man, he must be that, or Jim wouldn't have been fond of him. Besides, she had seen it for herself in the way he had helped her and Lucy. She could not let him be alone with his sad thoughts, and he had a double burden of sad thoughts, a double loss to bear, for he had lost her brother as well as his poor wife. Who knew they had Fortnite back in the 1920s? Wild. All Entwhistles were compassionate, and as she and Weems sat together or together paced, she kept up a flow of gentle, loving kindness. Weems smoked his pipe in practically unbroken silence. This was his way when he was holding on to himself. Miss Entwistle, of course, didn't know he was holding on to himself, and taking his silence for the inarticulateness of deep unhappiness, was so much touched that she would have done anything for him, anything that might bring this poor, kind, suffering fellow creature comfort, except to go to Ostend. From that dreadful suggestion she continued to shudder away, nor, though he tried again, even after all arrangements for leaving Cornwall had been made, would she be persuaded to stay where she was. Therefore, Weems was forced to conclude that she was obstinate as well as selfish, and it hadn't been for the brief moments at meals when Lucy appeared, and through her unhappiness, what she was doing was obviously depressing her very much, smiled faintly at him, and always went and sat as near him as she could. He would have found those 2 days intolerable. How atrocious, he thought, while he smoked in silence and held on to himself, that Lucy should be taken away from him by a mere maiden lady, an aunt, an unmarried aunt, weakest and most negligible, surely, of all the relatives. How atrocious that such a person should have any right to come between him and Lucy, to say she wouldn't do this, that, or the other that Weems proposed, and thus possesses the power to make him unhappy. Miss Entwistle was so little that he could have brushed her aside with the back of one hand. Yet here, again, the strong monster public opinion stepped in and forced him to acquiesce in any plan she chose to make for Lucy, however desolate it left him, merely because she stood to her in the anemic relationship of aunt. How dare her family become between her and this stranger? Exactly. Aw, Pan, thank you so much for contributing to the Sunday stream. Sunday stream will be this Sunday, and I will be playing Monkey Island for the very first time. I know nothing about it, and I am excited. Oh, no worries, no worries. We're just glad when you're able to come. During 2 mortal days, as he waited about in that garden so grievously infested by Miss Entwistle, sounds of boxes being moved and drawers being opened and shut came through the windows. But except at meals, there was no Lucy. He could have borne it if he hadn't known they were the very last days he would be with her. But as things were, it seemed cruel that he should be left like that to be miserable. Why should he be left like that to be miserable, just because of a lot of clothes and papers, he asked himself, and he felt he was getting thoroughly tired of Jim. "Haven't you done yet?" he asked at tea, on the second afternoon of the sorting and packing, when Lucy got up to go indoors again, leaving him and Miss Entwistle, even before he had finished his second cup of tea. "You've no idea what a lot there is," she said, her voice sounding worn out, and she lingered a moment, her hand on the back of her aunt's chair. "Father brought all his notes with him, and heaps of letters from people he was consulting, and I'm trying to get them straight, get them as he would have wished." Miss Entwistle put up her hand and stroked Lucy's arm. "If you weren't in this hurry to go away, you'd have had more time and done it comfortably," said Weems. "Oh, but I don't want more time," said Lucy quickly. "Lucy means she couldn't bear it drawn out," said Miss Entwistle, leaning her thin cheek against Lucy's sleeve. "These things, they tear one's heart, and nobody can help her. She has to go through with it alone." And she drew Lucy's face down to hers and held it there a moment, gently stroking it, the tears brimming up again in the eyes of both. Always tears, thought Weems. Yes, there are always would-be tears as long as that aunt had hold of Lucy. She was the arch wallower, he told himself, filling his pipe in silence after Lucy had gone in. He got up and went out at the gate and crossed the road and stood staring at the evening sea. Should he hear steps coming after him and Miss Entwistle were to follow him even beyond the garden, he would proceed without looking round down to the cove and to the inn, where she must needs leave him alone. He had had enough. That Miss Entwistle should explain to him what Lucy meant, he considered to be the last straw of her behavior. Barging in, he said indignantly to himself, barging in when nobody had asked her opinion or explanation of anything. And she had stroked Lucy's face as though Lucy and her face and everything about her belonged to her, merely because she happened to be her aunt. Fancy explaining to him what Lucy really meant, taking upon herself the functions of interpreter, of go-between, when for a whole day and a half before she appeared on the scene, and she had only appeared on it at all thanks to his telegram, Lucy and he had been in the closest fellowship, the closest communion. Well, things couldn't go on like this. He was not the man to be dominated by a relative. If he had lived in those sensible ancient days when people behaved wholesomely, he would have flung Lucy over his shoulder and walked off with her to Ostend or Paris and laughed at such insects as ants. He couldn't do that, unfortunately, though where the harm would be in two mourners like himself and Lucy going together in search of relief, he must say he was unable to see. Why should they be condemned to search for relief separately? Their sorrows, surely, would be their chaperone, especially his sorrow. Nobody would object to Lucy's nursing him, supposing he were dangerously ill. Why should she not be equally beyond the reach of tongues if she nursed the bitter wounds of his spirit? He heard steps coming down the garden path to the gate. There, he thought, was the aunt again, searching for him, and he stood squarely and firmly with his back to the road, smoking his pipe and staring at the sea. If he heard the gate open and she dared to come through it, he would instantly walk away. In the garden, he had to endure being joined by her, because there he was in the position of guest. But let her try to join him on the king's highway. It's so annoying that I just can't abduct her, um, because of the social cues that we have nowadays. If it was the good old days, totally would abduct her. Nobody would say anything. Okay, Weems. Okay, Weems. Nobody opened the gate, however, and as he heard no retreating footsteps either, after a minute he began to want to look around. He struggled against this wish, because the moment Miss Entwistle caught his eye, she would come out to him, he felt sure. But Weems was not much good at struggling against his wishes. He usually met with defeat, and after briefly doing so on this occasion, he did look around. And what a good thing he did. For it was Lucy. There she was, leaning on the gate just as she had been the first morning, but this time her eyes, instead of being wide and blank, were watching him with a deep and touching interest. She got across the road in one stride. "Lucy," he exclaimed. Why didn't you call me? We've wasted half an hour." "About 2 minutes," she said, smiling at him as he, on the other side of the gate, folded both her hands in his just as he had done that first morning, and the relief it was to Weems to see her again alone, to see that smile of trust and, surely, content in getting back to him. Then her face went grave again. "I've finished Father's things now," she said, "and so I came to look for you." "Lucy, how can you leave me?" was Weems's answer to that, his voice vibrating. "How can you go away from me tomorrow and hand me over again to the torments, yes, torments, I was in before?" "But I have to go," she said, distressed. "And you mustn't say that. You mustn't let yourself be like that again. You won't be. I know. You're so brave and strong." Not without you. I'm nothing without you, said Weems, and his eyes, as he searched hers, were full of tears. At this, Lucy flushed, and then, staring at him, her face went slowly white. These words of his, the way he said them, reminded her— oh no, it wasn't possible. He and she stood in a relationship to each other like none, she was sure, that had ever yet been. It was an intimacy arrived at a bound, with no preliminary steps. It was a holy thing, based on mutual grief, protected from everything ordinary by the great wings of death. He was her wonderful friend, big in his simplicity, all care for her and goodness, a very rock of refuge and shelter in the wilderness she had been flung into when he found her. And that he, bleeding as he was himself from the lacerations of the violent rending asunder from his wife to whom he had been, as he had told her, devoted, that he should— oh no, it wasn't possible, and she hung her head, shocked at her thoughts. For the way he had said those words, and the words themselves had reminded her— no, she could hardly bear to think it, but they had reminded her of the last time she had been proposed to. The man, he was a young man. She had never been proposed to by anyone even approximately Weems's age. Had said almost exactly that. Without you, I am nothing. And just in the same deep, vibrating voice. How dreadful thoughts could be, Lucy said to herself, overcome that such a one at— how dreadful thoughts could be, Lucy said to herself, overcome that such a one at such a moment should thrust itself into her mind. Hateful of her. Hateful. She hung her head in shame, and Weems, looking down at the little bobbed head with its bright, thick, young hair bent over their folded hands, as though it were saying its prayers. Weems, not having his pipe in his mouth to protect him and help him to hold on to himself, for he had hastily stuffed it in his pocket, all alight as it was, when he saw her at the gate, and there at that moment it was a burning hole. Weems, after a brief struggle with his wishes, in which as usual he was defeated, stooped and began to kiss Lucy's hair. And having begun, he continued. She was horrified. At the first kiss she started as if she had been hit, and then, clinging to the gate, she stood without moving, without being able to think or lift her head, in the same attitude, bowed over his and her own hands, while this astonishing thing was being done to her hair. Death all round them, death pervading every corner of their lives, death in its blackest shape brooding over him, and kisses. Her mind, if anything so gentle could be said to be in anything that sounds so loud, was in an uproar. She had had the complete, guileless trust in him of a child for a tender and sympathetic friend. A friend, not a father, though he was old enough to be her father, because in a father, however much hidden by sweet comradeship as it had been in hers, there always, at the back of everything was, after all, authority. And it had been even more than the trust of a child in its friend. It had been the trust of a child in a fellow child, hit by the same punishment, a simple fellowship, a wordless understanding. Falkor, I'm having the same exact reaction. I'm so upset. She hung on to the gate while her thoughts flew about in confusion within her. These kisses, and his wife just dead, and dead so terribly. How long would she have to stand there with this going on? She couldn't lift up her head, for then she felt it would only get worse. She couldn't turn and run into the house because he was holding her hands. He oughtn't to have— oh, he oughtn't to have— it wasn't fair. Then, what was he saying? She heard him say, in an absolutely broken voice, laying his head on hers, "We two poor things. We two poor things." And then he said and did nothing more, but kept his head like that. And presently, thick though her hair was, through it came wetness. At that, Lucy's thoughts suddenly stopped flying about and were quite still. Her heart went to wax within her, melted again into pity, into a great flood of pitiful understanding, the dreadfulness of lonely grief. Was there anything in the world so blackly desolate as to be left alone in grief? This poor broken fellow creature, and she herself so lost in loneliness. They were two half-drowned things, clinging together in a shipwreck. How could she let him go? Leave him to himself? How could she be let go? Left to herself? "Lucy," he said, "look at me." She lifted her head. He loosed her hands and put his arms round her shoulders. "Look at me," he said. For though she had lifted her head, she hadn't lifted her eyes. She looked at him. Tears were on his face. When she saw them, her mouth began to quiver and twitch. She couldn't bear that. "Lucy," he said again. She shut her eyes. "Yes," she breathed. "Yes." And with one hand she felt along up his coat till she reached his face, and shakingly tried to brush away its tears. End of chapter 5. The rage is simmering. Chapter 5. Ew. I look forward to these one-worded reviews from you for every chapter now, Pam. Yeah, that was pretty gross. Mm, mm, I'm upset. All right. Chapter 6. It's a short one. They might be around. That's totally fine. I mean, if every chapter was just ew, it's probably accurate. And I would enjoy it each time. So, chapter 6. We are 16%. After that, for the moment anyhow, it was all over with Lucy. She was engulfed. Weems kissed her shut eyes. He kissed her parted lips. He kissed her dear, delightful bobbed hair. Her tears dried up, or his tears dried up, or rather, wiped away by her little blind, shaking hand. There were no more of them. Death for Weems was indeed at that moment swallowed up in victory. Instantly he passed from one mood to the other, and when she finally did open her eyes at his orders and look at him, she saw bending over her a face she hardly recognized, for she had not yet seen him happy. Happy? How could he be happy? As happy as that all in a moment? She stared at him, and even through her confusion, her bewilderment was, frankly, amazed. Then the thought crept into her mind that it was she who had done this. It was she who had transformed him, and her stare softened into a gaze almost of awe, with something of the look in it of a young mother when she first sees her newborn baby. So that is what it's like, the young mother whispers to herself in a sort of holy surprise, and I have made it, and it is mine. And so, gazing at this new, effulgent Weems, did Lucy say to herself with the same feeling of wonder, of awe at her own handiwork, so that is what he is like. There is no emote to express the look of disgust. That, yes. There are questions. Yeah, for sure, for sure. Weems's face was indeed one great beam. He simply, at that moment, couldn't remember that he had ever been miserable. He seemed to have his arms round love itself, for never did anyone look more like the very embodiment of his idea of love than Lucy, than as she gazed up at him, so tender, so resistless. But there were even more wonderful moments after dinner in the darkening garden. while Miss Entwistle was upstairs packing ready to start by the early train next morning, and they hadn't got the gate between them, and Lucy of her own accord laid her cheek against his coat, nestling her head into it as though there indeed she knew that she was safe. Are you ready? My baby, Weems murmured, in an ecstasy of passionate protectiveness, in his turn flooded by maternal feeling. You shall never cry again. Never. Never. It irked him that their engagement, Lucy demurred at first to the word engagement, but Weems, holding her tight in his arms, said he would very much like to know, then, by what word she would describe her position at that moment. It irked him that it had to be a secret. He wanted instantly to shout out to the whole world his glory and his pride. But this, under the tragic circumstances of their mourning, was even to Weems clearly impossible. Generally, he brushed aside the word impossible if it tried to come between him and the smallest of his wishes, but that inquest was still too vividly in his mind, and the faces of his so-called friends. What the faces of his so-called friends would look like if he, before Vera had been dead a fortnight, should approach them with the news of his engagement, even Weems, a person not greatly imaginative, could picture. And Lucy, quite overwhelmed, first by his tears and then by his joy, no longer could judge anything. She no longer knew whether it was very awful to be lovemaking in the middle of death, or whether it were, as Weems said, the natural, glorious self-assertiveness of life. She knew nothing any more except that he and she, shipwrecked, had saved each other, and that for the moment nothing was required of her, no exertion, nothing at all, except to sit passive with her head on his breast, while he called her his baby, and softly, wonderfully, kissed her closed eyes. Yes, his previous wife was Vera. She couldn't think. She needn't think. Oh, she was tired, and this was rest. But after he had gone that night, and all the next day in the train without him, and for the first few days in London, misgivings laid hold of her. That she should be being made love to, be engaged, as Weems insisted, within a week of her father's death, could not, she thought, be called anything worse than possibly and at the outside in irrelevance. It did no harm to her father's dear memory. It in no way encroached on her adoration of him. He would have been the first to be pleased that she should have found comfort. But what worried her was that Everard, Weems's Christian name was Everard. What a terrible name. Everard. Should be able to think of such things as love and more marriage when his wife had just died so awfully, and he on the very spot, and he the first to rush out and sing. Everard Weems! Evie Weems! Evie Weemies! That's what his closest friends call him, obviously. She found that the moment she was away from him, she couldn't get over this. It went round and round in her head as a thing she was unable, by herself, to understand. While she was with him, he overpowered her into a torpor, into a shouting of her eyes and her thoughts, into just giving herself up, after the shocks and agonies of the week, to the blessedness of the soothed and caressed semi-consciousness. And it was only when his first letters began to come, such simple, adoring letters, taking the situation just as it was, just as life and death between them had offered it, untroubled by questioning, undimmed by doubt, with no looking backward but with a touching, thankful acceptance of the present, that she gradually settled down into that placidity which was at once the relief of the astonishment of her aunt. And his letters were so easy to understand. They were so restfully empty of the difficult thoughts and subtle, half-said things her father used to write and all his friends. His very handwriting was the round, slow handwriting of a boy. Lucy had loved him before, but now she fell in love with him, and it was because of his letters. End of chapter 6. Can you imagine the surprise that the aunt would have gotten and been like, I thought he was like best friends with your dad? And maybe she still thinks that. I don't know. But then to find out that they're like together. Chapter 6. Why? Period. hmm That's what I thought too. And I thought that she was trying to like woo him in the same, almost the same, not as persistent way that Weems was doing with Lucy. To be like, so we're both going through things. Maybe we could lean on each other. We probably are of similar age, which would probably be more appropriate. Yeah, 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 yeah. Mm, mm, mm. And yet, here we are. It's the whole fact that he's old enough to be her father. Yeah, yeah. But Weems likes how Lucy's haircut makes her look like an actual child. You're right, Falcor. I forgot about that. If the aunt had the haircut to make her look like a child, then maybe things would have been different. Wadsworth, thank you so much for contributing to Sunday's stream. Oh, power of a haircut. Okay, chapter 7. We are 17% of the way through. Miss Entwistle lived in a slim little house in Eaton Terrace. It was one of those little London houses where you go in and there's a dining room, and you go up and there's a drawing room, and you go up again and there's a bedroom and a dressing room, and you go up yet more and there's a maid's room and a bathroom, and then that's all. For one person, it was just enough. For two, it was difficult. It was so difficult that Miss Entwistle had never had anyone stay with her before, and the drawing room had to be cleared out of all her clothes and toques, which then had nowhere to go to, and became objects that you met at night hanging over banisters or perched with an odd air of dashingness at the end of the bath before Lucy could go in. But no Entwistle ever minded things like that. No trouble seemed to any of them too great to take for a friend. While as for one's own dear niece, if only she could have been induced to take the real bedroom and let her aunt, who knew the dressing room's way, sleep there instead, that aunt, on such liberal principles was this family constructed, would have been perfectly happy. Lucy, of course, only smiled at that suggestion, and inserted herself neatly into the dressing room. In the first weeks of their mourning, which Miss Entwistle had dreaded for them both, proceeded to flow by with a calm, an unruffledness that could best be described by the word placid. In that small house, unless the inhabitants were accommodating and adaptable, daily life would be a trial. Miss Entwistle well knew Lucy would give no trouble that she could help, but their both being in such trouble themselves would, at such close quarters, she had been afraid, inevitably keep their sorrow raw by sheer rubbing against each other. To her surprise and great relief, nothing of the sort happened. There seemed to be no rawness to rub. Not only Lucy didn't fret, her white face and heavy eyes of the days in Cornwall had gone, but she was almost from the first placid. Just on leaving Cornwall, and for a day or two after that, she was a little, oh no, she was a little French word. Bouleversée? I'll type it into chat. B, B, yes. And there's an accent over the E that's right after the S. Oh, maybe Kindle will tell me what it means. Nope. Cool. Okay. Just on leaving Cornwall, and for a day or two after, she was a little bouleversée, upset, okay, and had a curious kind of timidity in her manner to her aunt, and crept rather than walked about the house. But this gradually disappeared, and if Miss Entwhistle hadn't known her, hadn't known of her terrible loss, she would have said that here was someone who was quietly happy. Overwhelmed, shattered. I love all of these words. Cool, cool, cool. Thank you. It was subdued, but there it was, as if she had some private source of confidence and warmth. Had she by any chance got religion? Wondered her aunt, who herself had never had it, and neither had Jim, and neither had any Entwhistles she had ever heard of. She dismissed that. It was too unlikely for one of their breed. But even the frequent necessary visits to the house in Bloomsbury she and her father had lived in so long didn't quite blot out the odd effect Lucy produced of being somehow inwardly secure. To turn upside down. I also like that one. Presently, when these sad settlings up were done with, and the books and furniture stored, and the house handed over to the landlord, and she no longer had to go to it and be among its memories, her face became what it used to be, delicately colored, softly rounded, ready to light up at a word, at a look. Miss Entwhistle was puzzled. This serenity of the one who was, after all, chief mourner, made her feel it would be ridiculous if she outdid Lucy in grief. If Lucy could pull herself together so marvelously, and she supposed it must be that, it must be that she was heroically pulling herself together. She, for her part, wouldn't be behindhand. Her darling Jim's memory should be honored, then, like this. She would bless God for him, bless God that she had had him, and in a high thankfulness continued cheerfully on her way. Such were some of Miss Entwhistle's reflections and conclusions as she considered Lucy. She seemed to have no thought of the future, again to her aunt's surprise and relief, who had been afraid she would very soon begin to worry about what she was to do next. She never talked of it. She never apparently thought of it. She seemed to be, yes, that was the word, decided Miss Entwhistle, observing her. Resting. But resting on what? A second time Miss Entwhistle dismissed the idea of religion. Impossible, she thought. That Jim's girl. Yet it did look very like religion. There was, it appeared, enough money left scraped together by Jim for Lucy in case of his death to produce about £200 a year. This wasn't much, but Lucy apparently didn't give it a thought. Probably she didn't realize what it meant, thought her aunt, because of her life with her father having been so easy, surrounded by all those necessities for an invalid which were, in fact, to ordinary people, luxuries. No one had been appointed her guardian. There was no mention of Mr. Weems in the will. It was a very short will, leaving everything to Lucy. This, as far as it went, was admirable, thought Miss Entwhistle, but unfortunately there was hardly anything to leave, except books, thousands of books, and the old charming furniture of the Bloomsbury house. Well, Lucy should live with her for as long as she could endure the dressing-room, and perhaps they might take a house together, a little less tiny, though Miss Entwhistle had lived in the one she was in for so long that it wouldn't be very easy for her to leave it. Meanwhile, the first weeks of mourning slid by in an increasing serenity, with London empty and no one to intrude on what became presently distinctly recognizable as happiness. She and Lucy agreed so perfectly. And they weren't together alone, either, for Mr. Weems came regularly twice a week, coming on the same days and appearing so punctually on the stroke of 5 that at last she began to set her clocks by him. He, too, poor man, seemed to be pulling himself together. He had none of the air of the recently bereaved, either in his features or his clothes. Not that he wore colored ties or anything like that, but he certainly didn't produce an effect of blackness. His trousers, she observed, were gray, and not a particularly dark gray either. Well, perhaps it was no longer the fashion, thought Miss Entwistle, eyeing these trousers with some doubt, to be very unhappy. But she couldn't help thinking there ought to be a band on his left arm to counteract the impression of light-heartedness in his legs. A crepe band, no matter how narrow, or a band of black, anything, but not necessarily crepe, such as she was sure it was usual in these circumstances to wear. However, whatever she felt about his legs, she welcomed him with the utmost cordiality, mindful of his kindness to them down in Cornwall, and of how she had clung to him there as her rock, and she soon got to remember the way he liked his tea, and had the biggest chair placed comfortably ready for him. The chairs were neither very big nor numerous in her spare little drawing-room, and did all she could in the way of hospitality and pleasant conversation. But the more she saw of him, and the more she heard of his talk, the more she wondered at Jim. Mr. Weems was most good-natured, and she was sure, as she knew from experience, was most kind and thoughtful. But the things he said were so very unlike the things Jim said, and his way of looking at things was so very unlike Jim's way. Not that there wasn't room in the world for everybody, Miss Entwistle reminded herself, sitting at her tea-table observing Weems, who looked particularly big and prosperous in her small, frugal room, and no doubt one star differed from another in glory. Still, she did wonder at Jim. And if Mr. Weems could bear the loss of his wife to the extent of gray trousers, how was it he couldn't bear Jim's name so much as mentioned? Whenever the talk got on to Jim, it couldn't be kept off, him in a circle composed of his daughter and his sister and his friend, she noticed that Mr. Weems went silent. She would have taken this for excess of sensibility and the sign of a deep capacity for faithful devotion if it hadn't been for those trousers. Faced by them, it perplexed her. While Miss Entwistle was thinking like this and observing Weems, who never observed her at all after a first moment of surprise that she should look and behave so differently from the liquid lady of the cottage in Cornwall, that she should sit so straight and move so briskly, he and Lucy were, though present in body, absent in love. Round them was drawn that magic circle through which nobody and nothing can penetrate, and within it they sat hand in hand and safe. Lucy's whole heart was his. He only had to come into the room for her to feel content. There was a naturalness, a bigness about his way of looking at things that made intricate, tormenting feelings shrink away in his presence, ashamed. Quite apart from her love for him, her gratitude, her longing that he should go on, now being happy and forget his awful tragedy, he was so very comfortable. She had never met anyone so comfortable to lean on mentally. Bodily, on the few occasions on which her aunt was out of the room, he was comfortable too. He reminded her of the very nicest of sofas, expensive ones, all cushions. But mentally he was more than comfortable. He was positively luxurious. Such perfect rest, listening to his talk. No thinking needed. Things, according to him, were either so or so. With her father, things had never been either so or so, and one had had to frown and concentrate and make efforts to follow and understand his distinctions, his infinitely numerous, delicate, difficult distinctions. Everard's plain division of everything into two categories only, snow white and jet black, was as reposeful as the Roman Church. She hadn't got to strain or worry. She had only to surrender. And to what love? To what safety? At night she couldn't go to bed for thinking of how happy she was. She would sit quite still in the little dressing room, her hands in her lap, and a proverb she had read somewhere running in her head. When God shuts the door, he opens the window. Not for a moment, hardly, had she been left alone to suffer. Instantly, almost, Everard had come into her life and saved her. Lucy had indeed, as her aunt had twice suspected, got religion, but her religion was Weems. Ah, how she loved him, and every night she slept with his last letter under her pillow on the side of her heart. As for Weems, if Lucy couldn't get over having got him, he couldn't get over having got Lucy. He hadn't had such happiness as this, of this quality of tenderness, of goodness in his life before. What he had felt for Vera had not at any time, he was sure, even at the beginning, been like this. While for the last few years, oh well. Weems, when he found himself thinking of Vera, pulled up short. He declined to think of her now. She had filled his thoughts enough lately, and how terribly. His little angel Lucy had healed that wound, and there was no use in thinking of an old wound. Nobody healthy ever did that. He had explained to Lucy, who at first had been a little morbid, how wrong it is, how really wicked, besides being intensely stupid, not to get over things. Life, he had said, is for the living. Let the dead have death. The present is the only real possession a man has, whatever clever people may say. And the wise man, who is also the natural man of simple healthy instincts, and a proper, natural shrinking from death and disease, does not allow the past, which after all, anyhow, is done for, to intrude upon, much less spoil, the present. That is what he explained. The past will always do if it can. The only safe way to deal with it is to forget it. There is some suspicious omission of information. Absolutely. Absolutely. And let's not think of the past, all right? It's already happened. It's already happened. I'm just thinking about the William Faulkner quote. The past is never dead. It's not even past. Oh, hello, Captain Hardship. Hello, hello. Yes. Yes, yes, yes. Very much Thriller vibes. And not the Michael Jackson kind. But I don't want to forget mine, Lucy had said at last, opening her eyes, which as usual had been shut, because the commas of Weems's talk with her, when they chanced to be alone, were his soothing, soporific kisses dropped gently on her closed eyelids. Father, oh, you may remember yours, he had answered, smiling tenderly, down at the head lying on his breast. It's such a little one. But you'll see when you're older if your Everard wasn't right. To Weems, in his new happiness, it seemed that Vera had belonged to another life altogether, an elderly, stale life from which, being healthy-minded, he had managed to unstick himself and to emerge born again all new and fresh and fitted for the present. No, she's just thinking about her father. Oh my gosh, you panicked me, Falcor. No, she did not call him father. She's just saying that she wants to continue remembering her father. Yes. There is a jump scare. Yes, yes, yes. I know. Oh my gosh. We don't need any more twisted sickness in this. I'm sure we're gonna get some, but that's a line that we don't need to cross. mm, okay. Everard was right. There we go. 1920s daddy issues are still gross. Yes, they are. To Weems, in his new happiness, it seemed that Vera had belonged to another life altogether, an elderly, stale life, from which, being healthy-minded, he had managed to unstick himself and to emerge born again all new and fresh and fitted for the present. She was 40 when she died. She had started life 5 years younger when he was, but 5 years younger than he was, but had quickly caught him up and passed him, and had ended, he felt, by being considerably his senior. And here was Lucy, only 22 anyhow, and looking like 12. Gross. The contrast never ceased to delight him, to fill him with pride. And how pretty she was, now that she had left off crying. He adored her bobbed hair that gave her the appearance of a child or a very young boy, and he adored the very delicate lines of her nose and nostrils and her rather big, kind mouth that so easily smiled, and her sweet eyes, the color of love in a mist. Not that he set any store of prettiness, he told himself. All he asked in a woman was devotion. But her being pretty would make it only the more exciting when the moment came to show her to his friends, to show his little girl to those friends who had dared slink away from him after Vera's death and say, "Look here, look at this perfect little thing. She believes in me, all right." End of chapter 7. It's looks like everybody's loving this one. You would be correct. There's a lot going on with this one, Captain Hardship. Oh boy. Chapter 7. Can we just Exactly. Mhm. Yes, lots of barf, lots of ew. Mhm. Yeah. Chapter 8. We are 20% of the way through. London being empty, Weems had it all his own way. No one else was there to cut him out, as his expression was. Lucy had many letters with offers of every kind of help from her father's friends, but naturally she needed no help and had no wish to see anybody in her present condition of secret contentment. She had replied to them with thanks and vague expressions of hope that later on they might all meet. One young man, he was the one who often proposed to her, wasn't to be put off like that, and journeyed all the way from Scotland, so great was his devotion, and found out from the caretaker of the Bloomsbury house that she was living with her aunt, and called at Eaton Terrace. But that afternoon Lucy and Miss Entwhistle were taking the air in a car Weems had hired, and at the very moment the young man was being turned away from the Eaton Terrace door, Lucy was being rowed about the river at Hampton Court, very slowly, because of how soon Weems got hot, and her aunt, leaning on the stone parapet at the end of the palace gardens, was observing her. It was a good thing the young man wasn't observing her too, for it wouldn't have made him happy. "What is Mr. Weems?" asked Miss Entwhistle unexpectedly that evening, just as they were going to bed. "Good old sweaty Weems." Lucy was taken aback. Her aunt hadn't asked a question or said a thing about him up to then, except general comments on his kindness and good nature. "What is Mr. Weems?" she repeated stupidly, for she was not only taken aback, but also, she discovered, she had no idea. It had never occurred to her even to wonder what he was, much less ask. She had been, as it were, asleep the whole time in the perfect contentment of his breast. "Yes. What is he besides being a widower?" "He's a creep," said Miss Entwhistle. "We know he's that, but it is hardly a profession." I I don't think I know," said Lucy, looking and feeling very stupid. "Oh, well, perhaps he isn't anything," said her aunt, kissing her goodnight. "Except punctual," she added, smiling, pausing a moment at her bedroom door. And 2 or 3 days later, when Weems had again hired a car to take them for an outing to Windsor, while she and Lucy were tidying themselves for tea in the ladies' room of the hotel, she turned from the looking-glass in the act of pinning back some hair loosened by motoring, and in spite of having a hairpin in her mouth, said again suddenly, "What did Mrs. Weems die of?" This unnerved Lucy. If she had stared stupidly at her aunt at the other question, she stared aghast at her at this one. "What did she die of?" she repeated, flushing. "Yes, what illness was it?" asked her aunt, continuing to pin. "It wasn't an illness," said Lucy, helplessly. "Not an illness? I believe it was an accident." An accident, said Miss Entwistle, taking the hairpin out of her mouth and in her turn staring. What sort of an accident? I think a rather serious one, said Lucy, completely unnerved. How could she bear to tell that dreadful story, the knowledge of which seemed somehow so intimately to bind her and Everard together with this sacred, terrible tie? At that, her aunt remarked that an accident resulting in death would usually be described as serious, and asked what its nature, apart from its seriousness, had been. And Lucy, driven into a corner, feeling instinctively that her aunt, who had already once or twice expressed what she said was her surprised admiration for Mr. Weems's heroic way of being his bereavement, might be too admiringly surprised altogether if she knew how tragically much he really had to bear, and might begin to inquire into the reasons of his heroism, took refuge in saying what she now saw she ought to have begun by saying, even though it wasn't true, that she didn't know. Ah, said her aunt. Well, poor man. It's wonderful how he bears things. And again, in her mind's eye, and with an increased doubt, she saw the grey trousers. That day at tea, Weems, with the simple naturalness Lucy found so restful, the almost bald way he had of talking frankly about things more sophisticated people wouldn't have mentioned, began telling them of the last time he had been at Windsor. It was the summer before, he said, and he and his wife, at this Miss Entwistle became attentive, had motored down one Sunday to lunch in the very room, and it had been so much crowded, and the crowding had been so monstrously mismanaged, that positively they had had to go away without having had lunch at all. Positively without having had any lunch at all, repeated Weems, looking at them with a face full of astonished aggrievement at the mere recollection. Ah, said Mrs. Entwinkle, leaning across him, don't let us revive sad memories. Oh, Pan, you got a tie. At least it wasn't a loss. Weems stared at her. Good heavens, he thought. Did she think he was talking about Vera? Anyone with a grain of sense would know he was only talking about the lunch he hadn't had. He turned impatiently to Lucy, and addressed his next remark to her. But in another moment there was her aunt again. Mr. Weems, she said, I've been dying to ask you. Again he was forced to attend. The pure air and rapid motion of the motoring intended to revive and brace his little love were apparently reviving and bracing his little love's aunt as well, for lately he had been unable to avoid noticing a tendency on her part to assert herself. During his first 8 visits to Eaton Terrace, that made 4 weeks since his coming back to London and 6 since the funeral at Cornwall, he had hardly known she was in the room, except, of course, when she was in the room, completely hindering his courting. During those 8 visits, his first impression of her remained undisturbed in his mind. She was a wailing creature who had hung round him in Cornwall in a constant state of tears. Down there she had behaved exactly like a traditional foolish woman when there was a death about. No common sense, no grit, crying if you looked at her, and keeping up a continual dismal recital of the virtues of the departed. Also, she had been obstinate, and she had, besides, shown unmistakable signs of selfishness. When he paid his first call in Eaton Terrace, he did notice that she had considerably, indeed completely, dried up, and was therefore to that extent improved. But she still remained for him just Lucy's aunt, anybody who poured out the tea, and who, unfortunately, hardly ever went out of the room, a necessary, though luckily a transitory, evil. But now it was gradually being borne in on him that she really existed, on her own account, independently. She asserted herself. Even when she wasn't saying anything, and often she had hardly a word during an entire outing, she still somehow asserted herself. And here she was asserting herself very much indeed, and positively asking him across a tea table, which was undoubtedly for the moment his, asking him straight out what, if anything, he did in the way of a trade, profession, or occupation. She was his guest, and regarded it as less than seemly for a guest to ask a host what he did. Not that he wouldn't gladly have told her if it had come from him of his own accord. Surely a man has a right, he thought, to his own accord. At all times, Weems disliked being asked questions. Even the most innocent, ordinary question appeared to him to be an encroachment on the right he surely had to be let alone. Lucy's aunt, between sips of tea, his tea, pretended pleasantly it was true, and clothing what could be nothing but idle curiosity in words that were not disagreeable, that she was dying to know what he was. She could see for herself, she said, smiling down at the leg nearest her, that he wasn't a bishop. She was sure he wasn't either a painter, musician, or writer, but she wouldn't be in the least surprised if he were to tell her he was an admiral. Weems thought this intelligent of the aunt. He had no objection to being taken for an admiral. They were an honest, breezy lot. Placated, he informed her that he was on the stock exchange. Ah, nodded Miss Entwistle, looking wise because on this subject she so completely wasn't, the stock exchange being an institution whose nature and operations were alien to anything the Entwistles were familiar with. Ah yes, quite. Bulls and bears. Now I come to look at it, you have the stock exchange eye. Foolish woman, thought Weems, who for some reason didn't like being told before Lucy that he had the stock exchange eye, and he dismissed her impatiently from his mind and concentrated on his little love, asking himself while he did so how short he could, with any sort of propriety, cut this unpleasant time of restricted courting, of never being able to go anywhere with her unless her tiresome aunt came too. Nearly 2 months now since both those deaths. Surely Lucy's aunt might soon be told now of the engagement. It was after this outing that he began in his letters, and in the few moments he and she were alone, to urge Lucy to tell her aunt. Nobody else need know, he wrote. It could go on being kept a secret from the world, but the convenience of her aunt's knowing was so obvious. Think of how she would then keep out of the way. Think of how she would leave them to themselves, anyhow, indoors, anyhow, in the house in Eaton Terrace. Lucy, however, was reluctant. Good girl, Lucy. Well, not really. She demurred. She wrote begging him to be patient. She said that every week that passed would make their engagement less a thing that need surprise. She said that at present it would take too much explaining, and she wasn't sure that even at the end of the explanation her aunt would understand. It absolutely would backfire on Weems. 1000%. Weems wrote back, brushing this aside. He said her aunt would have to understand, and if she didn't, what did it matter so long as she knew? The great thing was that she should know. Then, he said, she would leave them alone together, instead of forever sticking, and his little love must see how splendid it would be for him to come and spend happy hours with her quite alone. What was an aunt, after all, he asked. What could she possibly be compared to Lucy's own Everard? Besides, he disliked secrecy, he said. No honest man could stand an atmosphere of concealment. His little girl must make up her mind to tell her aunt, and believe that her Everard knew best, or, if she preferred it, he would tell her himself. Lucy didn't prefer it, and she was beginning to feel worried, because as the days went on, Weems grew more and more persistent, the more he became bored by Miss Entwistle's development of an independent and inquiring mind, and she hated having to refuse or even to defer doing anything he asked. When her aunt, one morning at breakfast, in the very middle of apparent complete serene absorption in her bacon, looked up suddenly from the coffee pot and said, "How long had your father known Mr. Weems?" This settled things. Lucy felt she could bear no more of these shocks. A clean breast was the only thing for her. Aunt Dot, she stammered. Miss Entwistle's Christian name was Dorothy. I'd like. I've got. I want to tell you. After breakfast, said Miss Entwistle briskly. We shall need lots of time and to be undisturbed. We'll go up into the drawing room. And immediately she began talking about other things. Was it possible, thought Lucy, her eyes carefully on her toast and butter, that Aunt Dot suspected? End of chapter 8. Mm, mm, mm. Yeah, the little girl thing, so gross. My little girl. Ugh. Mm. Also, I love the description of her aunt being in the very middle of apparent complete serene absorption in her bacon. Because I too feel that way when I eat bacon. Chapter 8, I can't even. Yes. I I do worry very much about the aunt. I think you guys are right. I think something is going to happen because the aunt obviously suspects that something is going on. Like whether or not like it's about the death of Vera or about like the relationship between the father and him or between Lucy and him, something's going to happen. Weems isn't going to like it, and the aunt's going to have an accident, a serious accident. And I worry. I worry about you, my friend. Aunt Dot, good old Aunt Dot, I worry. So freaking awful. So many times it says things about how he can't help himself acting on his impulses. Mm-hmm. How he deserves to get whatever he wants. Exactly. Or exactly. Or she'll, yes, yes. Yeah, that's also a fear. Like something terrible is going to happen to this aunt, is what I feel. And I mean, they could do the whole thing where like he does like kidnap her and then the aunt is like completely fine and they just don't tell Aunt Dot like where she is. But I don't think that's going to happen. And I'm scared. I'm scared. Also, please stop calling her. Please stop calling Lucy your little girl. I don't like it. When the description is she could be 22, she could be 12, she could be a little boy, and then to call her your little girl. Yes. It would be much worse if it was supposed to be. Yes, it would be much worse if it was supposed to be a romance, for sure, for sure. Playing this as a romance might even get. Yes, yes. Ugh. 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 Oh, so many dry heaves. Mm-mm. Mm-mm. That might need to be like my next gif. It's just like ugh, ugh. No sound effects though. But I feel like we need that. Gross. Okay. All right. Chapter 9. It probably should have been an uncomfy, not cozy reading stream, uncomfy reading stream. You're right, Captain Hardship. You're totally right. The title is deceiving. Mm. Mm-hmm. Falcor, yes. Gross. Yes, and gross and ew. All right, here we go. Comfy. There we go. Maybe we should do that. Comfy reading stream. We'll do that for next time, for sure. Hopefully I remember. Yes. That's too perfect. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, chapter 9. We're 22% of the way through. Here we go. It was not only possible, but the fact. Aunt Dot had suspected, only she hadn't suspected anything like all that was presently imparted to her, and she found great difficulty in assimilating it. And 2 hours later, Lucy, standing in the middle of the drawing room, was still passionately saying to her, and saying it for perhaps the 10th time, "But don't you see? It's just because what happened to him was so awful. It's nature asserting itself. If he couldn't be engaged now, if he couldn't reach up out of such a pit of blackness and get into touch with living things again and somebody who sympathizes and is fond of him, he would die. Die or go mad. And oh, what's the use to the world of somebody good and fine being left to die or go mad? Aunt Dot, what's the use?" And her aunt, sitting in her customary chair by the fireplace, continued to assimilate with difficulty. Also, her face was puckered into folds of distress. Same. She was seriously upset. Lucy, looking at her, felt a kind of despair that she wasn't being able to make her aunt, whom she loved, see what she saw, understand what she understood, and so be, as she was, filled with confidence and happiness. Not that she was happy at that moment. She, too, was seriously upset, her face flushed, her eyes bright with effort to get Weems as she knew him, as he so simply was, through into her aunt's consciousness. You're not the only one, exactly. She had made her clean breast with a completeness that had included the confession that she did know what Mrs. Weems' accident had been, and she had described it. Her aunt was painfully shocked. Anything so horrible as that hadn't entered her mind. To fall past the very window her husband was sitting at. It seemed to her dreadful that Lucy should be mixed up in it, and mixed up so instantly on the death of her natural protector, of her two natural protectors, for hadn't Mrs. Weems, as long as she existed, also been one? She was bewildered, and couldn't understand the violent reactions that Lucy appeared to look upon as so natural in Weems. She would have concluded that she didn't understand because she was too old, because she was out of touch with the elasticities of the younger generation, but Weems must be very nearly as old as herself. Certainly he was the same generation, and yet behold him, within a fortnight of his wife's most shocking death, able to forget her, able to fall in love. But that's why, Lucy cried when Miss Entwistle had said this. He had to forget or die himself. It was beyond what anybody could bear and stay sane. I'm very glad he should stay sane, said Miss Entwistle, more and more puckered. But I can't help wishing it hadn't been you, Lucy, who are assisting him to stay it. And then she repeated what at intervals she had kept on repeating with a kind of stubborn helplessness, that her quarrel with Mr. Weems was that he had got happy so very quickly. "Those gray trousers," he murmured. No. Miss Entwistle couldn't get over it. She couldn't understand it. And Lucy, expounding and defending Weems in the middle of the room with all the blaze and emotion of what was only too evidently genuine love, was to her aunt an astonishing sight. That little thing, defending that enormous man, Jim's daughter, Jim's cherished little daughter. Miss Entwistle, sitting in her chair, struggled, among other struggles, to be fair, and reminded herself that Mr. Weems had proved himself to be most kind and eager and to help down in Cornwall, though even on this there was shed a new and disturbing light, and that now that she had everything, and the doubts that had made her perhaps be a little unjust were out of the way, and she could begin to consider him impartially, she would probably very soon become sincerely attached to him. She hoped so with all her heart. She was used to being attached to people. It was normal to her to like and be liked, and there must be something more in him than his fine appearance for Lucy to be so very fond of him. She gave herself a shake. She told herself she was having this thing badly, that she ought not, just because it was an unusual situation, be so ready to condemn it. Was she really only a conventional spinster, shrinking back shocked at a touch of naked naturalness? Wasn't there much in what the short-haired child was so passionately saying about the rightness, the saneness of reaction from horror? Wasn't it nature's own protection against too much death? After all, what was the good of doubling horror, of being so much horrified at the horrible that you stayed rooted there and couldn't move and become, with your starting eyes and bristling hair, a horror yourself? Better, of course, to pass on, as Lucy was explaining, to get on with one's business, which wasn't death, but life. Still, there were the decencies. However desolate one would be in retirement, however much one would suffer, there was a period, Miss Entwistle felt, during which the bereaved withdrew. Instinctively. The really bereaved would want to withdraw. But you don't see, Lucy once more tried despairingly to explain. This wasn't just being bereaved. This was something simply too awful. Of course Everard would have behaved in the ordinary way if it had been an ordinary death. So that the more... Whoop, whoop. Hold on. Oh no, I totally lost the page. Oh, there we are. Okay. Somehow I skipped like 4 pages. Okay. So that the more terrible ones sorrow, the more cheerfully one goes out to tea, said Miss Entwistle, the embrace of the light trousers at the end of Weems and the unmistakably satisfied face at the other being for a moment too much for her. Almost moaned Lucy at that, and her head drooped in a sudden fatigue. Miss Entwistle got up quickly and put her arms around her. "Forgive me," she said. "That was just stupid and cruel. I think I'm hidebound. I think I've probably got into a rut. Help me out of it, Lucy. You shall teach me to take heroic views." And she kissed her hot face tenderly, holding it close to her own. "But if I could only make you see," said Lucy, clinging to her, tears in her voice. "But I do see that you love him very much," said Miss Entwistle gently, again very tenderly kissing her. That afternoon when Weems appeared at 5 o'clock, it being his bi-weekly day for calling, he found Lucy alone. "Why, where, how," he asked, peeping round the drawing-room as though Miss Entwistle must be lurking behind a chair. "I've told," said Lucy, who looked tired. Then he clasped her with a great hug to his heart. "Everard's own little love," he said, kissing and kissing her. "Everard's own good little love." "Yes, but—" began Lucy faintly. She was, however, so much muffled and engulfed that her voice didn't get through. "Now, wasn't I right?" he said, triumphantly, holding her tight. "Isn't this as it should be? Just you and me and nobody to watch or interfere?" "Yes, but—" began Lucy again. "What do you say? Yes, but—" laughed Weems, bending his ear. "Yes, without any but, you precious little thing. Buts don't exist for us. Only yeses." And on these lines the interview continued for quite a long time before Lucy succeeded in telling him that her aunt had been much upset. Weems minded that so little that he didn't even ask why. He was completely incurious about anything her aunt might think. "Who cares?" he said, drawing her to his heart again. "Who cares? We've got each other. What does anything else matter? If you had 50 aunts, all being upset, what would it matter? What can it matter to us? And Lucy, who was exhausted by her mourning, felt, too, as she nestled close to him, that nothing did matter so long as he was there. But the difficulty was that he wasn't there most of the time, and her aunt was, and she loved her aunt, and did very much hate that she should be upset. She tried to convey this to Weems, but he didn't understand. When it came to Miss Entwistle, he was as unable to understand Lucy as Miss Entwistle was unable to understand her when it came to Weems. Only Weems didn't in the least mind not understanding. Ants. What were they? Insects, he laughed, and said his little love couldn't have it both ways. She couldn't eat her cake, which was her Everard, and have it, too, which was her aunt. And he kissed her hair and asked who was a complicated little baby, and rocked her gently to and fro in his arms. And Lucy was amused at that, and laughed, too, and forgot her aunt, and forgot everything except how much she loved him. Yeah, a lot just happened just then. Meanwhile, Miss Entwistle was spending a diligent afternoon in the newspaper room of the British Museum. She was reading the Times report on the Weems accident and inquest, and if she had been upset by what Lucy told her in the morning, she was even more upset by what she read in the afternoon. Lucy hadn't mentioned the suggestion of suicide. Perhaps he hadn't told her. Suicide. Well, there had been no evidence. There was an open verdict. It had been a suggestion made by a servant, perhaps a servant with a grudge. And even if it had been true, probably the poor creature had discovered she had some incurable disease, or she may have had some loss that broke her down temporarily, and, oh, there were many explanations. Respectable, ordinary explanations. Miss Entwistle walked home slowly, loitering at shop windows, staring at hats and blouses that she never saw, spinning out her walk to its utmost, trying to think. Suicide. How desolate it sounded on that beautiful afternoon. Such a giving up, such a defeat. Why would she have given up? Why should she have been defeated? But it wasn't true. The coroner had said there was no evidence to show how she came by her death. Miss Entwistle walked slower and slower. The nearer she got to Eaton Terrace, the more unwillingly did she advance. When she reached Belgrave Square, she went right round it twice, lingering at the garden railings, studying the habits of birds. She had been out all the afternoon, and, as those who had walked it know, it is a long way from the British Museum to Eaton Terrace. Also, it was a hot day, and her feet ached, and she very much would have liked to be in her own chair and her cool drawing-room having tea. But there in that drawing-room would probably still be Mr. Weems, no longer now to be Mr. Weems for her. Would she really have to call him Everard? Or she might meet him on the stairs, narrow stairs, or in the hall, also narrow, which he would fill up. Or on her doorstep she might meet him, filling up her doorstep. Or, when she turned the corner into her street, there, coming towards her, might be the triumphant trousers. No, she felt she couldn't stand seeing him that day. So she lingered forlornly, watching the sparrows inside the garden railings of Belgrave Square, balancing first on one and then on the other of those feet that ached. This was only the beginning, she thought. This was only the first of many days for her of wandering homelessly around. Her house was too small to hold both herself and love-making. If it had been the slender love-making of the young man who was so doggedly devoted to Lucy, she felt it wouldn't have been too small. He would have made love youthfully, shyly. She could have sat quite happily in the dining room while the suitably paired young people dallied delicately together overhead. But she couldn't bear the thought of being cramped up so near Mr. Weems. No, Everard's. She had better get used to that at once. Love-making. His way of courting wouldn't be, she searched about in her uneasy mind for a word, and found, vegetarian. Yes, that word sufficiently indicated what she meant. It wouldn't be vegetarian. Miss Entwistle drifted away from the railings and, turning her back on her own direction, wandered towards Sloane Street. There she saw an omnibus stopping to let someone out. Wanting very much to sit down, she made an effort and caught it, and squeezing herself into its vacant seat, gave herself up to wherever it should take her. It took her to the city. First to the city, and then to strange places beyond. She let it take her. Her clothes became steadily more fashionable the farther the omnibus went. She ended by being conspicuous and stared at. But she was determined to give the widest margin to the love-making and go the whole way, and she did. For an hour and a half the omnibus went on and on. She had no idea omnibuses did such things. When it finally stopped, she sat still, and the conductor, who had gradually come to share the growing surprise of the relays of increasingly poor passengers, asked her what address she wanted. She said she wanted Sloane Street. He was unable to believe it, and tried to reason with her, but she sat firm in her place and persisted. At 9 o'clock he put her down where she had taken her up. She disappeared into the darkness with the movements of one who is stiff, and she winked at the passenger nearest the door and touched his forehead. But as she climbed wearily and hungrily up her steps and let herself in with her latchkey, she felt it had been well worth it. For that one day, at least, she had escaped Everard. End of chapter 9. Yeah, Falcor. I was also thinking the same thing. Like, I know that it's wooing, but is it wooing? Yeah, for sure. For sure, for sure. And yes. Ugh, everything is upsetting. Chapter 9. Thin walls. Oh, terrible. Oh. All right. Chapter 10. We are a quarter of the way through. Alternatively, chapter 9, escaping Weems's bulk. She did talk about that a lot. Yes. Yeah, I mean, these chapters don't have names. We could definitely just name them perfectly. There's one curl in the middle of my forehead, and I'm gonna leave it there. There we go. Perfect. Don't know where it's going to go. Okay. Chapter 10. Miss Entwistle, however, made up her mind very firmly that after this one afternoon of giving herself up to her feelings, she was going to behave in the only way that is wise when faced with an inevitable marriage, the way of sympathy and friendliness. Oh, thanks, Falcor. They just do whatever they want. The solitary nomadic curl, also escaping Weems. So we'll put it back. There we go. Terrible. Okay. Too often had she seen the first indignation of disappointed parents at the marriages of their children harden into a matter of pride, a matter of doggedness and principle, and finally become an attitude unable to be altered, long after years had made it ridiculous. If the marriages turned out happy, how absurd to persist in an antiquated disapproval. If they turned out wretched, then how urgent the special need for love. Thus, Miss Entwistle reasoned that first sleepless night in bed, and on these lines she proceeded during the next few months. They were trying months. She used up all she had of gallantry in sticking to her determination. Lucy's instinct had been sound. That wish to keep her engagement secret from her aunt for as long as possible. Miss Entwistle, always thin, grew still more thin in her constant daily and hourly struggle to be pleased, to enter into Lucy's happiness, to make things easy for her, to protect her from the notice and inquiry of their friends, to look hopefully and with as much of Lucy's eyes as she could see at Everard and at the future. "She isn't simple enough," Weems would say to Lucy if she said anything about her aunt's increasing appearance of strain and overwork. "She should take things more naturally. Look at us." For it was the one fly in Lucy's otherwise perfect ointment, this intermittent consciousness that her aunt wasn't altogether happy. And then he would ask her, laying his head on hers as he stood with his arms around her, who had taught his little girl to be simple, and they would laugh and kiss and talk of other things. Miss Entwistle was unable to be simple in Weems's sense. She tried to, for when she saw his fresh, unlined face, his forehead without a wrinkle on it, and compared it in the glass of her own, which was only 3 years older, she thought there must be a good deal to be said for single-mindedness. It was Lucy who told her Everard was so single-minded. He took one thing at a time, she said, concentrating quietly. When he had completely finished it off then, and not till then, he went on to the next. He knew his own mind. Didn't Aunt Dot think it was a great thing to know one's own mind, instead of wobbling about, wasting one's thoughts and energies on sideshows? This was the very language of Weems, and Miss Entwistle, after having been listening to him in the afternoon, for every time he came she put in a brief appearance just for the look of the thing, and on the Saturday and Sunday outings she was invariably present the whole time, felt it a little hard that when at last she had reached the end of the day and the harbor of her empty drawing-room she should, through the mouth of Lucy, have to listen to him all the evenings as well. But she always agreed, and said yes, he was a great dear, for when an only and much-loved niece is certainly going to marry, the least a wise aunt can call for her future nephew is a great dear. She will make this warmer and more varied if she can, but at least she will say that much. Miss Entwistle tried to think of variations, afraid Lucy might notice a certain sameness, and once with an effort she faltered out that he seemed to be a real darling, but it had a hollow sound, and she didn't repeat it. Besides, Lucy was quite satisfied with the other. She used sitting at her aunt's feet in the evenings. Weems never came in the evenings because he distrusted the probable dinner, sometimes to make her aunt say it again, by asking a little anxiously, "But you do think him a great dear, don't you, Aunt Dot?" Whereupon Miss Entwistle, afraid her last expression of that opinion may have been absent-minded, would hastily exclaim with almost excess of emphasis, "Oh, a great dear." Perhaps he was a dear. She didn't know. What had she against him? She didn't know. He was too old, that was one thing. But the next minute, after hearing something he had said or laughed at, she thought he wasn't old enough. Of course, what she really had against him was that he had got over his wife's shocking death so quickly. Yet she admitted there was much in Lucy's explanation of this as a sheer instinctive gesture of self-defense. Besides, she couldn't keep it up as a grudge against him forever. With every day it mattered less, and sometimes Miss Entwistle even doubted whether it was this that mattered to her at all, whether it was not rather some quite small things that she really objected to, a want of fastidiousness, for instance, a forgetfulness of the minor courtesies, the objections, in a word, she told herself smiling, of an old maid. Lucy seemed not to mind his blunders in these directions in the least. She seemed positively, thought her aunt, to take a kind of pride in them, delighting in everything he said or did with the adoring tenderness of a young mother watching the pranks of her firstborn. She laughed gaily. She let him caress her openly. She, too, thought Miss Entwistle, had become what she no doubt would say was single-minded. Well, Perhaps all this was a spinster's way of feeling about a type not previously met with, and she had got, again she reproached herself, into an elderly groove. Jim's friends, well, they had been different, but not necessarily better. Mr. Weems would call them, she was sure, a finicking lot. When in October London began to fill again, and Jim's friends came to look her and Lucy up and showed a tendency, many of them, to keep on doing it, a new struggle was added to her others, the struggle to prevent their meeting Weems. He wouldn't, she was convinced, be able to hide his proprietorship in Lucy, and Lucy wouldn't ever get that look of tenderness out of her eyes when they rested on him. Questions as to who he was would naturally be asked, and one or other of Jim's friends would be sure to remember the affair of Mrs. Weems's death. Indeed, that day she went to the British Museum and read the report of it. She had been amazed that she hadn't seen it at the time. It took up so much of the paper that she was bound to have seen it if she had seen a paper at all. She could only suppose that as she was visiting friends just then, she chanced that day to have been in the act of leaving or arriving, and that if she bought a paper on the journey, she had looked, as was sometimes her way in trains, not at it, but out of the window. She felt she hadn't the strength to support being questioned, and in her turn have to embark on the explanation and defense of Weems. There was too much of him, she felt, to be explained. He ought to be separated into sections, and taken gradually and bit by bit, but far best not to produce him, to keep him from meeting her friends. She therefore arranged a day in the week when she would be at home, and discouraged everyone from the waste of time of trying to call on her on other days. Then presently the afternoon became an evening once a week, when whoever liked could come in after dinner and talk and drink coffee, because the evening was safer, made safe by Weems's conviction, he hadn't concealed it, that the dinners of maiden ladies were notoriously both scanty and bad. Hey, Atkinson. Hello, happy Thursday. Thank you so much for contributing for Sunday's stream. Lucy would have preferred never to see a soul except Weems, who was all she wanted, all she asked for in life. But she did see her aunt's point, that only by pinning their friends to a day and an hour could the risk of their overflowing into precious moments be avoided. This is how Miss Entwistle put it to her, wondering as she said it at her own growing ability in artfulness. She had an old friend living in Chesham Street, a window full of that ripe wisdom that sometimes comes at the end to those who have survived marriage, and to her, when the autumn brought her back to London, Miss Entwistle went occasionally in search of comfort. Oh, thank you so much. Good to see you as well. What in the whole world puts such a gulf between two affections and comprehensions as a new love? She asked one day, freshly struck, because of something Lucy had said, by the distance she had traveled. Lucy was quite a tiny figure now, so far away from her had she moved. She couldn't even get her voice to carry to her, much less still hold on to her with her hands. And the friend, made brief of speech by wisdom, said nothing. About Weems's financial position, Miss Entwistle could only judge from appearance, for it wouldn't have occurred to him that it might perhaps be her concern to know, and she preferred to wait till later, when the engagement could be talked about, to ask some old friends of Jim's to make the proper inquiries. But from the way he lived, it seemed to be an easy one. He went freely in taxis, he hired cars with a reasonable frequency, he inhabited one of the substantial houses of Lancaster Gate, and also, of course, he had the Willows, the house on the river near Strorley, where his wife had died. After all, what could be better than two houses? Miss Entwistle thought, congratulating herself, as it were, on Lucy's behalf that this side of Weems was so satisfactory. Two houses and no children. How much better than the other way about? And one day, feeling almost hopeful about Lucy's prospects, on the advantages of which she had insisted that her mind should dwell, she went round again to the window in Chesham Street, and said suddenly to her, who was accustomed to these completely irrelevant exclamatory inquiries from her friend, and who, being wise, was also incurious, "What can be better than two houses?" To which the widow, whose wisdom was more ripe than comforting, replied disappointingly, "One." Later, when the marriage loomed very near, Miss Entwistle, who found that she was more than ever in need of reassurance instead of being, as she had hoped to become, more reconciled, went again, in the kind of desperation this time, to the widow, seeking some word for her who was so wise that would restore her to tranquillity, that would dispel her absurd persistent doubts. "After all," she said, almost entreatingly, "what can be better than a devoted husband?" And the widow, who had had three, and knew what she was talking about, replied with the large calm of those who had finished, and can in leisure weigh and reckon up, "None." That's great. What's better than two houses? One house. What's better than having a loving husband? Having none. I love that answer from a widow. That's so funny. All right, that was the end of chapter 10. That one was not as cringy, more introspective, you know? Oh, Pan, thank you so much for the hydrate. Thank you, thank you. Chapter 10, less ew. A little less ew. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, for sure, for sure. Well, and it's because Weems and Lucy weren't in that chapter. Chapter 10. Copium. Yeah. This is the bridge section. In interval. Ooh, okay, this next chapter is a long one. So I'm assuming there's gonna be some upsetting moments. I mean, the first four words are the Weems and Whistle engagement, so let's stretch a little bit. This is me stretching, just like I'm gonna play the piano if I was in an NSYNC video. Or Thriller. I don't know. All right, crisscross applesauce over here. Do you read mostly digital or physical? I prefer reading physical. It's just easier to get digital faster, if that makes sense. Because I mostly don't buy, I just borrow. Ah, thank you so much, Falcor. Yeah, or if the book is super heavy, I don't like that either. My wrists are too genteel and they will break if the book is really heavy. Mm. I went to a used bookstore, one that I haven't been to, and it was exactly what a used bookstore should be. Just like stacks and stacks of books, and the aisles were like super like windy and extremely small, and it was great, and it just smelled of old paper. It was wonderful. It was so perfect. I loved it so much. And I'm so surprised that I haven't been there before. You have a little used bookstore down the store? Yeah, or down the street? Yes. Go. Go. Especially, I mean, this one didn't have it, at least not that I found, but with used bookstores with like a fun little like pet, super cute. I love it so much. You wish you could read physical more? Yes. Oh, okay. Interesting. Yeah, I mean, if digital works for you, for sure, for sure. Also with digital, like you can make the font not for mice and it's wonderful. Like some books, like the font is for teeny tiny mice and it's upsetting. It's a wonder that I don't have glasses or contacts. I'm sure one day I will. Give me the huge font, please. Please and thank you. That's all I want. You like digital for nonfiction, but physical for fiction and poetry. Ooh, that's a cool divide. Yeah. Interesting, interesting. I mean, if I have to like take notes, then I like physical. I don't know why. I just do. Or like for tabbing purposes, like it's so much easier on like a physical book. You like whichever one the library will send me faster. That's fair, long souls. That's fair. It is nice being, yes, to carry around a whole library. Yes, if you're, especially if you're traveling, or even if you're just like walking in the park, because this is totally what everybody does, is just like walk in a park or in a cemetery or whatever, and you're like, this is the perfect time for me to read a book, and you just like pull it out of your bag. Yeah, so much easier to pull out something small instead of like a big, I don't know, a big book. Like a massive Lord of the Rings or a massive, I don't know, what's big? Wheel of Time or something like that. Like those are heavy. You can highlight more, yes, and leave more digital notes on digital. That's true. That's true. Absolutely. Very true. But if you're referencing a lot of books, then physical is better. Yes. And three, yes. And of course, at least three tables. Yes. And coffee or tea and snacks. But like not messy snacks. I am a monster when it comes to snacks. I love snacks so much. But if you give me chocolate, which yes, please, I will accept it. Um I always get it on me. I don't know how. I am a toddler monster and will just get chocolate like on my pants, on whatever I'm sitting on. Like I don't understand what it is. I don't get it. I don't know how this happens. You're the same way. Okay, cool. Like it's just like something magical happens when I'm eating chocolate. I cannot explain it. I love PB&J. Love it. What is your favorite J for a PB&J? And also, do you do crunchy or do you do smooth? These are the big questions. Exactly. I am not a messy eater, but chocolate, something mystical happens and a mess explodes. Welch's grape, smooth Jif. Okay. I did not know. Pause for a dance break. Chickies, thank you so much for the follow. Welcome in. Hello, hi. I didn't know that other people didn't do this, but in making a PB&J, I put butter on it. I butter both sides of the breads and then put a peanut butter and then a jelly. I didn't know that wasn't a thing. I okay. Any jelly or jam, crunchy peanut butter. Yeah. Oh, I'm doing all right. We're talking about PB&J and snacks right now. Just a little breather before we get really creepy with this book. Creepy cringy. Ooh. See, I was not allowed to have the combined jar. Jam always, never jelly. Man, we are drawing some lines in the sand right now. Jam is good. Jam is the one like with the like fruit bits in it, right? Like, is that the distinction between jam and jelly? Jelly is more American. That sounds right. Peach preserves? Ooh. What the fanciest PB&J. Jam preferred for me, but you're not about to turn down some jelly. Yeah, for sure, for sure. That's fair. Peach preserves sounds amazing. Yes, it absolutely does. So I enjoy all jams, jellies, but like you would think that I would be messy with that too, but I'm not. It's literally just chocolate. I'm 35-year-old bean who still loves a PB&J. I'm right there with you. There is no age limit for PB&Js. Oh no. Time to go to the grocery store. More peanut butter. We always have multiple backups at home. Peanut butter at home, just in case. You can never have too many, just in case. Are they all crunchy, or do you also have smooth? You know, I don't know. For guests, I don't know. Oh no, the worst, the worst. It's rare for me to find a jam or jelly that I don't like, but when I do, oof, yeah, yeah. This is almost related, but not quite. But I'm gonna make it related. Speaking of jam and jelly, and then I was like, grape jam or jelly, juice. And then I was thinking, grape juice. Grape juice makes me extremely thirsty, and I will not drink it because it just makes me so thirsty. Apple juice, I will drink. Orange juice is fine as long as it's not super pulpy because that's gross. I don't want little chunks in my drink. But you got Smucker's strawberry spread in a squeeze bottle and it tasted like bad jello. Disgusting. Yes, I am more thirsty after drinking grape juice, so I don't drink it. I always, like, if I have to drink a juice, I will go for either pineapple orange juice or apple because it's delicious. You live 5 to 10 minutes from an orchard. Ooh, that sounds amazing. Yes, yes. Perfect living conditions. Oh, real cider. Oh, that makes me happy. What's it like living so near to a lovely chaos queen? Let me tell you, it is both lovely and chaos all the time. Yes. Those exact words describe exactly what it's like living so near. Ugh. Yeah, yeah. She's doing. Who is the Chaos Queen? It is Tamara Chambers. Let me see if I can I do a thing if she's not here? Oops, I have to spell her name right though. I can. Yeah, Tamara Chambers. She does a lot of gaming stuff. We did a collaboration stream on Valentine's Day. Very chaotic, but also very lovely. More, yes, more to come. Yes, you're right. We actually need to discuss that. We have not discussed when our next collaboration will be. Oh, please send it to me. Please. I want I want to see. And that sounds wonderful. Okay, let's go back to reading. Just because it is a longer chapter and I know that we're going to have comments in between. Chapter 11. Here we go. The Weems Entwistle engagement proceeded on its way of development through the ordinary stages of all engagements. Secrecy complete, secrecy partial, semi-publicity, and immediately after that entire publicity, with its inevitable accompanying uproar. The uproar, always more or less audible to the protagonists, of either approval or disapproval, was in this case one of unanimous disapproval. Lucy's father's friends protested to a man. The atmosphere at Eaton Terrace was convulsed, and Lucy, running as she always did to hide from everything upsetting into Weems's arms, was only made more certain than ever that there alone was peace. This left Miss Entwistle to face the protests by herself. There was nothing for it but to face them. Jim had had so many intimate, devoted friends, and each of them apparently regarded his daughter as his special care and concern. One or two of the youngest ones, who had been disciples rather than friends, were in love with her themselves, and these were specially indignant and vocal in their indignation. Miss Entwistle found herself in the position she had tried so hard to avoid, that of defending and explaining Weems to a highly skeptical, antagonistic audience. It was as if, forced to fight for him, she was doing so with her back to her drawing room wall. Lucy couldn't help her, because though she was distressed that her aunt should be being worried because of her affairs, yet she did feel that Everard was right when he said that her affairs concerned nobody in the world but herself and him. She, too, was indignant, but her indignation was because her father's friends, who had been, ever since she could remember, always good and kind, besides perfectly intelligent and reasonable, should with one accord, and without knowing anything about Everard except that story of an accident, be hostile to her marrying him. The ready unfairness, the willingness immediately to believe the worst instead of the best, astonished and shocked her. And then the way they all talked. Everlasting arguments and reasoning and hair-splitting. So clever, so impossible to stand up against, and yet so surely, she was certain, if only she had been clever too, would and able to prove things wrong. All their multitudinous points of view, why, there was only one point of view about a thing, Everard said, and that was the right one. Ah, but what a woman wanted wasn't this. She didn't want this endless thinking and examining and dissecting and considering. A woman, her very thoughts were now dressed in Weems's words, only wanted her man. Hers, not to reason why, Weems had quoted one day, and both of them had laughed at this parody. Hers, but to love and not die, but live. The most that could be said for her father's friends was that they meant well. But oh, what trouble the well-meaning could bring into an otherwise simple situation. From them she hid. It was inevitable. In Weems's arms. Here were no arguments. Here were no misgivings and paralyzing hesitations. Here was just simple love, and the feeling, delicious to her whose mother had died in the very middle of all the sweet early petting, and whose whole life since had been spent entirely in the dry and bracing company of unusually inquisitive-minded, clever men, of being a baby again in somebody's big, comfortable, uncritical lap. The engagement hadn't leaked out so much as flooded out. It would have continued secret for quite a long time, known only to the three and to the maids who, being young women themselves, and well acquainted with the symptoms of the condition, were sure of it before Miss Entwistle had even begun to suspect. If Weems hadn't taken to dropping in, contrary to expectations, on the Thursday evenings. Lucy's descriptions of these evenings and of the people who came, and of how very kind they were to her aunt and herself, and how anxious they were to help her, they, of course, supposing that she was, actually, the lonely thing she would have been if she hadn't had Everard as the dear hidden background to her life. At this point they embraced, at first amused him, then made him curious, and finally caused him to come and see for himself. He didn't tell Lucy he was coming. He just came. It had taken him 5 Thursday evenings of playing bridge as usual at his club, playing it with one hand, as he said to her afterwards, and thinking of her with the other. "You know what I mean," he said, and they laughed and embraced, before it slowly oozed into and pervaded his mind that there was his little girl, rounded by people fussing over her and making love to her, because, said Weems, everybody would naturally want to make love to her, and there was he, the only person who had a right to do this, somewhere else. Yeah, we're getting real creepy. Real creepy. Real creepy. So he walked in. And when he walked in, the group standing round Lucy with their backs to the door saw her face, which had been gently attentive, suddenly flash into color and light, and turning with one accord to see what it was she was looking at behind them, with parted lips and eyes of startled joy, beheld once more the unknown chief mourner of the funeral in Cornwall. Down there they had taken for granted that he was a relation of Jim's, the kind of relative who in a man's life appears only 3 times, the last of which is his funeral. Here in Eaton Terrace they were immediately sure he was not, anyhow, that, because for relatives who only appear those 3 times, a girl's face doesn't change in a flash, from gentle politeness to tremulous, shining life. They all stared at him, astonished. He was so different from the sort of people they had met at Jim's. For one thing, he was so well dressed. In the mating season, thought Miss Entwistle, even birds dress well. And in his impressive evening clothes, with what seemed a bigger and more spotless shirt front than any shirt front they could have imagined, he made them look and feel what they actually were, a dingy, shabby lot. Oh, thank you so much, man. Weems was good looking. He might be middle-aged, but he was good-looking enough frequently to eclipse the young. He might have a little too much of what tailors call a fine presence, but his height carried this off. His features were regular, his face carefree and healthy, his brown hair sleek with no gray in it. He was clean-shaven, and his mouth was the kind of mouth sometimes described by journalists as mobile, sometimes as determined, but always as well cut. One could visualize him in a fur-lined coat, thought a young man near Lucy, considering him, and one couldn't visualize a single one of the others, including himself, in the room that evening in a fur-lined coat. Also, thought this same young man, one could see railway porters and taxi drivers and waiters hurrying to be of service to him, and one not only couldn't imagine them taking any notice that wasn't languid and reluctant of the others, including himself, but one knew from personal distressing experience that they didn't. "My splendid lover," Lucy's heart cried out within her when the door opened and there he stood. She had not seen him before in the evening, and the contrast between him and the rest of the people there was really striking. Miss Entwistle had been right. There was no hiding the look in Lucy's eyes or Weems's proprietary manner. He hadn't meant to take any but the barest notice. Galloway, thank you so much for the follow. Welcome in. He hadn't meant to take any but the barest notice of his little girl. He had meant to be quite an ordinary guest, to shake hands and say, "Hasn't it been wet today?" That sort of thing. But his pride and love were too much for him. He couldn't hide them. He thought he did, and was sure he was behaving beautifully and with the easiest unconcern, but the mere way he looked at her and stood over her was enough. Also, there was the way she looked at him. The intelligences in that room were used to drawing more complicated inferences than this. They were outraged by its obviousness. Who was this middle-aged, prosperous outsider who had got hold of Jim's daughter? What had her aunt been about? Where had he dropped from? Had Jim known? Miss Entwistle introduced him. "Mr. Weems," she said to them generally, with a vague wave of her hand, and a red spot appeared and stayed on each of her cheekbones. Weems held forth. He stood on the hearth-rug, filling his pipe. He was used to smoking in that room when he came to tea with Lucy, and forgot to ask Miss Entwistle if it mattered, and told everybody what he thought. They were talking about Ireland when he came in, and after the disturbance of his arrival had subsided, he asked them not to mind him, but to go on. And he proceeded to go on himself, telling them what he thought. And what he thought was what the Times had thought that morning. Weems spoke with the practiced fluency of a leading article. He liked politics and constantly talked them at his club, and it created vacancies in the chairs near him. But Lucy, who hadn't heard him on politics before and found that she could understand every word, listened to him with parted lips. Before he came in, they had been saying things beyond her quickness in following, eagerly discussing Sinn Fein, Lord George, the outrageous cost of living. It was the autumn of 1920. There we go. We got time period. 1920. Turning everything inside out, upside down, being witty, being surprising, being tremendously eager and earnest. It had been a kind of restless flashing round and catching fire from each other, a kind of kick and flick and sparks, and a burst of laughter, and then on to something else just as she was laboriously getting underway to follow the last sentence. But 6. She had been missing her father, who took her by the hand on these occasions when he saw her lagging behind, and stopped a moment to explain to her, and held up the others while she got her breath. But now came Everard, and in a minute everything was plain. He had the effect on her of a window being thrown open and fresh air and sunlight being let in. He was so sensible, she felt, compared to these others, so healthy and natural. The government, he said, only had to do this and that, and Ireland and the cost of living would immediately, regarded as problems, be solved. He explained the line to be taken. It was a very simple line. One only needed goodwill and a little common sense. Why, thought Lucy, unconsciously nodding proud agreement, didn't people have goodwill and a little common sense? At first there was a disposition to interrupt, to heckle, but it grew fainter, and soon gave way to complete silence. The other guests might have been stunned, Miss Entwistle thought, so motionless did they presently sit. And when they went away, which they seemed to do earlier than usual and in a body, Weems was still standing on the hearthrug explaining the points of view of the ordinary, sensible businessman. Mind you, he said, pointing at them with his pipe, I don't pretend to be a great thinker. I'm just a plain businessman, and a plain businessman. I know there's only one way of doing a thing, and that's the right way. And find out what that way is, and go and do it. There's too much arguing altogether and asking other people what they think. We don't want talk, we want action. I agree with Napoleon, who said concerning the French Revolution. And then he speaks some French. Speaking some French. We're not simple enough. This was the last the others heard as they trooped in silence down the stairs. Outside they lingered for a while in little knots on the pavement talking, and then they drifted away to their various homes, where most of them spent the rest of the evening writing to Miss Entwistle. French intensifies! The following Thursday evening, her letters in reply having been vague and evasive, they came again, each hoping to get Lucy's aunt to himself, and on the ground of being Jim's most devoted friend, ask her straight questions such as who and what was Weems. Also, more particularly, why. Who and what he was of no sort of consequence, if he would only be and do it somewhere else. But they arrived determined to get an answer to the third question. Why Weems? And when they got there he was again. There before them this time, standing on the hearthrug as if he had never moved off it since the week before, and had gone on talking ever since. This was the end of the Thursday evenings. The next one was unattended, except by Weems. But Miss Entwistle had been forced to admit the engagement, and from then on, right up to the marriage, her life was a curse to her, and a confusion. Just because Jim had appointed no guardian in his will for Lucy, every single one of his friends felt bound to fill the vacancy. They were indignant when they discovered that almost before they had begun Lucy was being carried off, but they were horrified when they discovered what Weems it was who was carrying her off. Most of them quite well remembered the affair of Mrs. Weems's death a few weeks before, and those who did not went, as Miss Entwistle had gone, to the British Museum and read it up. They also, though they themselves were chiefly unworldly persons who lost money rather than made it, instituted the most searching private inquiries into Weems's business affairs. hoping that he might be caught out as such a rascal or so penniless, or preferably both, that no woman could possibly have anything to do with him. But Weems's business record, the solicitor they employed informed them, was quite creditable. Everything about it was neat and in order. He was not what the city would call a wealthy man, but if he went out saying to Ealing, said the solicitor, he would be called wealthy. He was solid, and he was certainly more than able to support a wife and family. He could have been quite wealthy if he had not adopted a principle to which he had adhered for years of knocking off work early and leaving his office at an hour when other men did not. The friends were obliged to admit that this at least seemed sensible. There had been, though, a very sad occurrence recently in his private life. "Oh, thank you," interrupted the friends. "We have heard about that." But however good Weems's business record might be, it couldn't alter their violent objection to Jim's daughter marrying him. Apart from the stuff he talked, there was the inquest. They were aware that in this they were unreasonable, but they were all too much attached to Jim's memory to be able to be reasonable about a man they felt so certain he wouldn't have liked. Singly and in groups they came at safe times, such as after breakfast, to Eaton Terrace to reason with Lucy, too much worried to remember that you cannot reason with a person in love. Less wise than Miss Entwistle, they tried to dissuade her from marrying this man, and the more they tried to, the tighter she clung to him. The passion of love was added by their attitudes, the passion of protectiveness, of flinging her body between him and them. And all the while inside her innermost soul, in spite of her amazement at them and her indignation, she was smiling to herself. For it was really very funny, the superficial judgment of these clever people when they sat side by side with what she alone knew, the tenderness, the simple goodness of her heart's beloved. Lucy laughed to herself in her happy sureness. She had miraculously found not only a lover she could adore, and a guide she could follow, and a teacher she could look up to, and a sufferer who without her wouldn't have been healed, but a mother, a nurse, and a playmate. In spite of his being so much older and so extraordinarily wise, he was yet her contemporary, sometimes hardly even that, so boyish was he in his talk and jokes. Lucy had never had a playmate. She had spent her life sitting, as it were, bolt upright and mentally behaving, and she hadn't known till Weems came on the scene how delicious it was to relax. Nonsense had delighted her father, it is true, but it had to be a certain kind, never the kind to which the adjective sheer would apply. With Weems, she could say whatever nonsense came into her head, sheer or otherwise. He laughed consumedly at her when she talked it. She loved to make him laugh. They laughed together. He understood her language. He was her playmate. Those people outside, old and young, who didn't know what playing was and were trying to get her away from him, might beat at the door behind which he and she sat listening, amused as long as they liked. "How they all try to separate us," she said to him one day, sitting as usual, safe in the circle of his arms, her head on his breast. "You can't separate unity," remarked Weems comfortably. She wanted to tell them that answer, confront them with it next time they came after breakfast, as a discouragement to useless further effort. But she had learned that they somehow always knew when what she said was Everard's and not her, and then, of course, prejudiced as they were, they wouldn't listen. "Now, Lucy, that's pure Weems," they would say. "For heaven's sake, say something of your own." At Christmas, Weems had an encounter with Miss Entwistle, who ever since she had been told of the engagement had been so quiet and inoffensive that he quite liked her. She had seemed to recognize her position as a sideshow, and had accepted it without word. She no longer asked him questions, and she made no difficulties. She left him alone with Lucy in Eaton Terrace, and though she had to go with him on the outings, she asserted herself so little that he forgot she was there. But when, towards the middle of December, he remarked one afternoon that he always spent Christmas at the Willows, and what day would she and Lucy come down, Christmas Eve or the day before, to his astonishment she looked astonished, and after a silence said it was most kind of him, but they were going to spend Christmas where they were. I had hoped you would join us. I had hoped you would join us, she said. Must you really go away? But, began Weems, incredulous, doubting his ears. It was, however, the fact that Miss Entwhistle wouldn't go to the Willows, and of course, if she wouldn't, Lucy couldn't either. Nothing that he said could shake her determination. Pure Weems. Here was a repetition, only how much worse. Fancy spoiling his Christmas, of her conduct in Cornwall when she insisted on going away from that nice little house where they were all so comfortably established, and taking Lucy up to London. He had forgotten, so acquiescent had she been for weeks, that down there he had discovered she was obstinate. It was a shock to him to realize that her obstinacy, the most obstinate obstinacy he had ever met, might be going to upset his plans. He couldn't believe it. He couldn't believe he wasn't going to be able to have what he wished, and only because an old maid said no. Was the story of Balaam to be reversed, and the angel be held up by the donkey? He refused to believe such a thing possible. Weems, who made his plans first and talked about them afterwards, hadn't mentioned Christmas, even to Lucy. It was his habit to settle what he wished to do, arrange all the details, and then, when everything was ready, inform those who were to take part. It hadn't occurred to him that over the Christmas question there would be trouble. He had naturally taken it for granted that he would spend Christmas with his little girl, and of course, as he always spent it at the Willows, she would spend it there too. All his arrangements were made, and the servants, who looked surprised, had been told to get the spare rooms ready for 2 ladies. He had begun to feel seasonable as early as the first week in December, and had bespoken 2 big turkeys instead of 1, because this was to be his first real Christmas at the Willows. Vera had been without the Christmas spirit, and he felt it couldn't be celebrated lavishly enough. 2 were there, had in previous years been 1, that was the turkeys. 4 were there, had been 2, that was the plum puddings. He doubled everything. Doubling seemed the proper, even the symbolic expression of his feelings, for wasn't he soon to be doubling himself? Thank you so much for the follow. Welcome in, welcome in. Hello, hello. Doubling seemed the proper, even the symbolic expression of his feelings, for wasn't he soon going to be doubled himself? And how sweetly. Then suddenly, having finished his preparations and proceeding, the time being ripe, to the question of the day of arrival, he found himself up against opposition. You want to see a magic trick? Why so serious? And how sweetly. And suddenly, Miss Entwhistle wouldn't go to the Willows. Incredible, impossible, and insufferable. While Lucy, instead of instantly insisting and joining with him in a compelling majority, sat as quiet as a mouse. But Lucy, Weems having stared speechlessly at her aunt, turned to her. But of course we must spend Christmas together. Oh, yes, said Lucy, leaning forward. Of course. But of course you must come down. Why, any other arrangement is unthinkable. My house is in the country, which is the proper place for Christmas, and it's your Everard's house, and you haven't seen it yet. Why, I would have taken you down long ago, but I've been saving up for this. We hoped, said Miss Entwhistle, you would join us here. Here. But there isn't room to swing a turkey here. I've ordered 2, and each of them is twice too big to get through your front door. "Oh, Everard, have you actually ordered turkeys?" said Lucy. She wanted to laugh, but she also wanted to cry. His simplicity was too wonderful. In her eyes, it set him apart from criticism and made him sacred, like the nimbus about the head of a saint. That he should have been secretly busy making preparations, buying turkeys, planning a surprise, when all this time she had been what? Supposing that why he never mentioned the Willows was because he shrank both for himself and for her from the house of this tragedy. There had never been any talk of showing it to her, as there had about the house in Lancaster Gate, and she had imagined he would never go near it again, and was probably quietly getting rid of it. He would want to get rid of it, of course, that house of unbearable memories. To the other one, the house in Lancaster Gate, he had insisted on taking them to tea, and in spite of a great desire not to go, plainly visible on her aunt's face, and felt too by herself, it had seemed, after all, a natural and more or less inevitable thing, and they had gone. At least that poor Vera had only lived there and not died there. It was a gloomy house, and Lucy had wanted him to give it up and start life with her in a place without associations, but he had been so much astonished at the idea. "Why?" he cried. "It was my father's house, and I was born in it," that she couldn't help laughing at his dismay, and was ashamed of herself for having thought of uprooting him. Besides, she hadn't known he had been born in it. The Willows, however, was different. Of that he never spoke, and Lucy had been sure of the pitiful and the delicate reason. Now it appeared that all this time he had just been saving it up as a Christmas treat. "Oh, Everard," she said with a gasp. She hadn't reckoned with the Willows, that the Willows should be in Everard's life, and actively so, not just lingering on while house agents were disposing of it, but visited and evidently prized, came upon her as an immense shock. "I think we can achieve a happy little Christmas for you here," said her aunt, smiling the smile she smiled when she found difficulty in smiling. "Of course you and Lucy would want to be together. I ought to have told you earlier that we were counting on you, but somehow Christmas comes on one so unexpectedly." "Perhaps you'll tell me why you won't come to the Willows," said Weems, holding on to himself as she used to make him hold on to himself in Cornwall. "You realize, of course, that if you persist, you spoil both Lucy's and my Christmas." "Ah, but you mustn't put it that way," said Miss Entwistle, gently but determined. "I promise you that you and Lucy shall be very happy here." "You haven't answered my question," said Weems, slowly filling his pipe. "I don't think I'm going to," said Miss Entwistle, suddenly flaring up. She hadn't flared up since she was 10, and was instantly ashamed of herself. But there was something about Mr. Weems. "I think," she said, getting up and speaking very gently, "you'll like to be alone together now." And she crossed to the door. Ford Mustang, thank you so much for the follow. Welcome in. Get it, Dot. I know, she's finally speaking out. I love it so much. She's like, "No, you're not going to Christmas over there." Then she wavered, and turning round, said more gently still, even penitentially, "If Lucy wishes to go to the Willows, I'll accept your kind invitation and take her. I leave it to her." Oh no, Aunt Dot. No longer standing up for her. Then she went out. "That's all right, then," said Weems, with a great sigh of relief, smiling broadly at Lucy. "Come here, little love. Come to your Everard, and we'll fix it all up. Lord, what a killjoy that woman was." And he put out his arms and drew her to him. End of chapter 11. I know. So Aunt Dot was so very close to like standing up and being amazing. Of course he's somebody who talks about himself in third person. Of course. Chapter 11, too much turkey. Okay, yes. Can we please talk about the math of this turkey? So, with two people, he ordered one turkey. With three people, he ordered two turkeys. I don't understand this. Why are you eating so much turkey? Why do you need so much plum pudding? I don't understand. Okay, fair. Fair. If the turkeys are like little turkeys, I'm imagining Costco turkeys, and it's just way too much. It's just too much. But yes, you're right. You're right. Depending on the weight of the turkey, maybe you need small turkeys. Or maybe you need two turkeys. Sorry. Weems would never order a little turkey. Big turkeys is a modern concept. You're totally right. You're totally right. Yes. Yes, yes, yes. Yes. Fine. It's still too much turkey and too much plum pudding. Typical Weems. Ugh. Big in 1921, perception versus 2023. Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, the like hormone induced turkeys of 20 American 2023 turkeys. For sure, for sure. It's still too much turkey. It's all about the sides, and the only side that he mentioned was plum pudding. I don't think I've ever had plum pudding, but can we talk about other sides? Like, where are the potatoes? There needs to be at least two different kinds of potatoes. We had a pack of turkeys just wandering around the neighborhood last year. Pan, you live in a magical world. So close to an orchard, packs of turkeys. I love this. You live in Narnia, which neither had turkeys nor an orchard, but in this Narnia it does. A magical land called Michigan. Michigan. So magical. Mm-mm-mm. Yeah, so cool. So they're definitely getting married and they're definitely spending Christmas together. Still worried about this aunt. I well, and now I don't know, do we need to worry about the aunt? Because if she's like outspoken but then is just like, well, I guess you can do it if that's what you really want, then maybe they can totally just sideswipe her in like a non-aggressive way. That's not what I meant. That's not the word that I meant to do. Sidestep. That's what I meant. Do turkeys attack if you get them angry? Anything attacks if you make it angry enough. Hello, hello, hi, hi, hi. Okay, you still think that we should be okay, okay. We'll still be nervous for Aunt Dot. I mean, I enjoy Aunt Dot. She is like the one character who is like mostly level-headed. And all of like Jim's friends. I think it's so funny that like Jim's friends, I forgot that they thought that Weems was a relative. I just don't understand. You're used to Canada geese. Yes. Canada geese are terrible. So mean and angry. The occasional deer will be out front in the lawn in the morning. Oh, amazing. The wood. Okay, Pan, I'm gonna be really mad if the answer is no, but do woodland creatures help you get ready in the morning? A la Snow White, because that is what I'm picturing. Oh, that is what I want for you. And even if the answer is no, that's what I'm gonna be picturing from now on. Oh, I'm doing all right. Sorry. I didn't see your message. Yes, I'm doing all right. Having a good time. They just make a ton of noise in our trees. Fine. Fine. Uh, I love deer. They're so great. Deer are wonderful creatures. Majestic, wonderful beasts. You used to live in a forest in England, amazing, where there were wild ponies and cows and donkeys that would look in the windows and walk down the street with you. Why did you move away from this place? That is amazing. I That's amazing. I I want that. I want that for everybody. Not just for me, for everybody. I'm a giver. We can all have this. That sounds so, so cool. Yes, yes. Oh, yeah, Pan. I totally understand that. For sure, for sure. I want donkey friends as well, Long. There's a 300-year-old mansion. Oh, that sounds so fun. I want to be in a forest with all those animal friends. Oh, you don't want the haunted part. Okay, fine. I mean, if anything is that old, it's obviously haunted. Obviously. And I'm so excited for like 300 years from now and like our generation being ghosts and like haunting things. And I love it so much. It makes me so happy because I want to haunt houses. Millennial ghosts haunting the kids. Back when I was your age, we had Zanga. You had to earn your top 8 on. Oh, the woman that lived in it was beheaded. Oh my gosh. Hello, Juicy Plants. Welcome in. Love your name. Hello. Hi, hi, hi. Thank you so much for the follow. The woman that lived there was beheaded. Terrifying. Okay, yeah, that place is obviously haunted. The woman obviously has some business that was never taken care of. You kids don't know the drama of putting a friend in your top 8 on MySpace. Yeah, no, she totally has business that she needs to take care of. And it's all of our faults, frankly, for not being able to distinguish what the rattling noises mean. Like, that's all it is. Oof. Oh. But yes, I'm very excited to be a ghost and haunt things. I know that I would be like terrible at haunting because I'm already aggressively apologetic. And would just be like, sorry to disturb you, but boo, boo. Are you scared? I'm sorry. I'll do it. I'll do it in the middle of the day when nobody's here. And I would totally be like useful and be like move your keys like if you're looking for them, but like move them to where like you could find them. Oh, Lil Bean just got to level 20. Amazing. Amazing. No longer a noob. I would be more like Casper. Yeah, I would be aggressively friendly, but also shy. Mhm. Mhm. Like I wouldn't ask you to be my friend or like to hang out with me because I know that that's going to be scary. But whatever. It's fine. Oh, all right. All right, my friend. I need to eat and go to the grocery store. And I will not forget the peanut butter. Falcor. Yes, thank you also so much. I will be back on, excuse me, tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. Central, doing reading sprints, productivity sprints, blah, blah, blah. And we'll be back reading Vera on Tuesday at 4 p.m. Central. But yeah, I hope you all have a great night. If I don't see you tomorrow, I hope you have a great weekend. My Sunday stream is on Sunday, so maybe I'll see you there. But yeah, whether you lurk, whether you chat, thank you so, so much. I appreciate your support and I appreciate you. Have a good night, everyone. Bye.